Today we're going to be building our own freelancing marketplace just like Fiverr without writing a single line of code using a tool called Bubble. There is so much that I want to cover within this video today, but before I say another word, let's dive in and take a preview of what we're going to be building. Over on our homepage here, I'm currently logged into an existing account I've created, and what you'll see is that at the top of our page we have the ability to search for specific services. Or perhaps we could scroll on down and filter through services by popular categories. If we even wanted, we could view some of the popular services inside of a category, so I could scroll across all these. Let's say I want to search for any services related to social media though. I'm going to type this in, I'll perform this search, and it's going to redirect us through to a search results page, which I can see there's 2 product listings. From here, I can then select to view this full product. Now, when I select on that product, it's going to send me through to the full product page, where I can not only view a list of all of the images that have been uploaded to this product, but I can see a full description, a price, as well as any reviews that have been left for the freelancer that offers this product. But let's say I'd like to make a purchase and actually buy this service. What I'm going to do is select my continue button here. I'm then going to review my order and I'm going to purchase this. Over in my checkout experience, I'm then going to add in all of my payment info, from which I'm then going to select to make this payment. It's going to process that order, and once that's been successfully paid for, it's going to redirect us back to our application and actually send us to a page where we can manage all of our orders we've placed. Now, if the user that's logged in is also a freelancer, they'll also be able to see a list of all of the orders they've received, from which they can easily manage these. So they can update the status of this order, or if they'd like, they can even send a message to the person who placed this order. And look, over in our message page, we can jump between all of the different conversations we have, and we can even send a response here directly inside of our app. And of course, this is going to update in real time as we send those messages. Now look, this is just a sample of all of the features within our product today. Behind the scenes, there's still so much happening that I haven't even shown you. There's things like a user settings page. So this is the page where they can update all of their details. There's the ability for users to upload product listings. So this is where freelancers can manage all of their services they offer. And look, even on top of that, there's still so many hidden features, workflows, and conditions that I can't wait to show you how I've built. If you've ever tried to build your own app or startup, you'll know firsthand how complicated it can be bringing your vision to life. I'm sure at this point you've probably tried to source a technical co-founder who could code, or you've asked someone to build the application for you, only to realize it's going to cost the same amount as a house deposit. And look, I get it, apps are cool and all, but sometimes you do actually need a place to sleep. But if you're looking to find the most cost and time effective way to bring your vision to life, Bubble's going to become your new best friend throughout your startup journey. Bubble is what's known as a no-code tool, which in simple terms just means that you can build fully functional apps without having to write a single line of code using their visual interface. When it comes to no-code tools, Bubble is by far my favorite. Not only does it give you the ability to create your own custom database, but it allows you to create a custom interface that your users will interact with. It also gives you the ability to stitch everything together using workflows, and of course the ability to integrate with third-party tools and services. Now look, each one of these features would be a standalone tool, so it truly just blows my mind that Bubble includes all of these in one single platform. And look, I'm going to be real, if you're going to try and save for that house, you're going to need to cut back on some of those subscriptions, particularly in this economy, am I right? Look, I have so much that I need to cover throughout this tutorial, so that's enough from me here. Let's grab our Bubble editor and we can get started. Within our tutorial today, the first thing we're going to do is not actually build out any core user-facing features. Instead, we're going to take the time to set up and configure our own custom database, which is going to be used to power the rest of our Fiverr clone build. Now, throughout our tutorial today, I've just created a list of everything we're going to cover within a Notion checklist here. So you'll see a list of all of the data types and fields we're about to add into our database, as well as a long list of all of the features that I'm going to cover throughout this full tutorial. And what I love about Notion is that it just allows you to create a checklist of items. So you can tick these along as you go on throughout the build. And of course, I'll be sure to include a link to this document in the description of this video, so that way you can make a duplicate of this template and follow along with me. But the very first thing I wanted to cover, as I mentioned, is building out our own custom database. Now, if you're relatively new to Bubble, this whole process can seem incredibly overwhelming. When I first started with Bubble, it took me quite a while to get my head around how you can actually build a custom database. But of course, it is your boy's job here to make things as easy as possible for you. So I'm only going to teach you what you need to know in order to create a fully functional database. And I'm not going to overcomplicate things along the way. We're going to tear it right down to the basics. And one of the most important things you need to understand when it comes to building out a database in Bubble is just the difference between data types and data fields. These are your two overarching things that are going to power the structure of your database. So a data type is an overarching entity. So you'll see here I have a list of data types. So this is things like my user, my business details, my product, and so on. So these are the overarching things that users are going to create within our database. And the way I like to plan out my database build is, first of all, I like to sit down and think about the application I'm creating. And so within that, I'll think about all of the features that users are going to interact with throughout our app. And from there, I just like to identify if users are ever going to create something within our application. And if a user is going to need to create something, that will 9 times out of 10 be a data type, because they're creating an actual entity or an entry in our database. And so for a good example, when a user registers an account, they're going to create a new user in our database. So that is why our user is a data type. Then whenever a user also signs up, I'd like to store some information about their business details. So if they were to type in the details of their business, they would be creating a new business in our database. Then let's say if a freelancer wanted to list their product or service within our marketplace, they'd be creating a new product. So you can start to see where I'm getting with here. And of course, I'm going to be sure to explain the full details of every single data type as I add it into my database. But the other thing I just want to touch base on first is the use of data fields. So within each data type, you'll see a checklist below that, and these are our data fields. So data fields are the actual information you want to store within a data type. So back to my example, if a user was to register an account, so if they create a new user entry in our database, what information will we need to store about that user? We might want to store things like their name, their about field, which is kind of like a bio, their profile photo, and a few other additional details. And so once again, before I even open up my Bubble application, I like to sit down and think about all of the information I'd like to store within my application. Then from there, I can actually structure my database. So when it comes to building inside of Bubble's editor, it just makes the whole process much more approachable, as I can easily just transfer these data types and fields across into my actual database. Now, if we were to open up our Bubble editor and head to our data tab, one thing I should point out is that by default, you're going to have this user data type already pre-created. And the reason for this is because in order for someone to actually use your application as a logged in user, they're going to need to create a user account. And of course, when you're creating that account, you're creating a new user. So that is why Bubble provides this data type by default. So on the left-hand side, you'll see a list of all of our data types we're about to create. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see a list of all of the fields that sit within each data type. And another thing you might notice is that also by default, the user data type has an email field already stored. And that's because when someone registers an account, they're going to need to store an email and a password. Now, Bubble also does provide a password field, but you just can't see this in plain text for security reasons. But it is there. So we won't actually need to create our user data type. What I'd like to do though first is add in all of our data types before we start building out any data fields. And the reason for that is because some of our data fields are actually going to need to link to data types. And of course, I'll explain that in more information when we get there. I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves now. But when you're creating your database, I'd strongly recommend that you build out all of your data types first. So if we were to jump back into Notion, I can see we have our user data type, which is already created. From here, there's our business details. Now, as I mentioned, the purpose of this data type is to store some information about a user's business. So within our application today, there's going to be 2 types of users. There's going to be freelancers, so they're the people selling their products and services. And then there's also going to be business owners. So these are the people who are hiring freelancers. Now, you can call these users whatever you want within your own application, but these are the examples I'm going to go with today. And so when a user registers an account, what I'd like to do is give them the option to list themselves as a business owner. in which case I'd like to store more details about the actual company. Now, theoretically, I could store all of this information under our user data type. But when it comes to Bubble, one thing I should just point out is how you can actually create a scalable database. And the way you can do that is by minimizing how much data you store under each data type. So let's say you have an application and you're going to load a list of users. So that is our user data type. Every time, let's say you load 10 different users, it's going to load all of the data fields for every single user. So it's going to load their name, their about section, their profile photo, and so on. And if you have all of these data fields under your user data type, that's a lot of data you need to load for every single person. Now that might be fine when you're loading 10 users, but let's say if you need to load a list of 100 or 1,000 people, your application is going to start to slow down. So what you'll see I've done today is I've split our data fields into some separate data types. But then I've created a link between these two data types, so that way if we ever need to reference a user's business details, we can easily do that. And look, I'll explain how we created that link when I build out our data fields, but just for the time being, I'm going to add the business details into our Bubble app. But the purpose of this data type is to store some more information about a person's company details. So we're going to jump into Bubble here, and I'm going to type in the words business details. And then from here, we'll jump back into our Notion checklist. We'll scroll on down, and the next data type we'll need to add in is the product. So as I mentioned, whenever a freelancer wants to list their services, I'm going to refer to that as a product. Fiverr kind of creates this notion that it's a productized service. So that's just the name I'm going to give that today. So I'm going to add this in as its own data type. I'll call this a product. I'll create that. It's nice and simple. We'll jump back into Notion. And the next thing I'll need to add in is the product details data type. Now, similar to the example I just gave you where I split our user data type from our business details, when it comes to our product, we're going to store some pretty large data on that. So for each product, I'd like to store information about things like the title, the description, a category, but there's also just going to be some large data fields. So things like the full description of the product, which could be a very long string of text, or even a list of images. So that way when someone views the product page, they can just scroll through a list of all of the images that the freelancer has uploaded. And so what I've done to ensure that our application won't slow down is I've split these larger data fields into a separate data type. So that way on our homepage or on our search results page, when we're loading a list of, let's say, 100 products, we're not loading all of the images and the description, because at that point in time, we don't actually need to display that data. It's only when someone clicks through and views that dedicated product page that we want to actually display that information. So I've split these into two separate data types. But of course, I'm going to show you in a moment how we can create a link between the two. So if we ever need to display the list of images for a product, we can easily reference those. But again, I just want to highlight that we're splitting these apart to help maintain the speed of our overall app. What I'm going to do though is jump into Bubble and I'm going to create a new data type called product details. We can then jump back into Notion, and if I scroll on down, I'm going to create another data type, and this one's going to be called our order. So each time a business owner wants to purchase the services from a freelancer, we're going to create an order in our database. That seems pretty straightforward. So we're just going to jump into Bubble, and we're going to type in the word order. Then if we jump back into our Notion checklist, the next data type is known as our reviews. So let's say if someone was to purchase a service from a freelancer, and once that project has been complete, the business owner should be able to leave a review for our freelancer. And so that's why every single time they create a review, we're going to need to create an entry in our database. So I'm going to jump over into our Bubble editor, and I'm going to create a data type called review. Now, I'm not going to call this reviews with a plural, because someone will only be able to create one review at a time. They're not going to create multiple reviews. And I just wanted to point that out now, because if you were to add a plural onto this, it might just make things a little bit confusing. In fact, in most cases, I tend to avoid adding a plural onto any data type names. The exception to that is if I'm storing things like business details, because they are almost like an extension of an existing data type. But that's just something that I wanted to point out. If we jump back into Notion though, I can scroll on down and I can see that there's two remaining data types we'll need to create. And these are related to a chat or inbox feature that we're going to create within our build. So let's say if a business owner was to purchase a service from a freelancer and they wanted to communicate with them throughout that experience, they're going to need a way to actually chat with each other through a messaging feature in our app. And every single time we create a chat between two users, we're going to need to create a data type to store who is in that chat. And then of course, within that chat, people are going to be able to send messages back and forward. So every single time someone sends a message, we're going to create a message in our database. So I'm just going to add these two data types. There's our chat and then there's our message. So if we jump into Bubble, I'm going to add our chat data type in. You can see I just have a small typo there. And then I'll have our message data type. And that is all of the data types we'll need to create. One thing I should just point out though is that if you look on the right-hand side here, you might notice that under our user data type, we have this privacy rule that's automatically applied by default. Now, if we were to click on this, it's going to take you through to your privacy tab. And what you'll see is this privacy setting that Bubble adds to your user data type. And this privacy rule is actually not something we want within our app today. So essentially, this privacy rule just says that users are only able to see data that they create. Now, while that might be helpful for things like internal tools, when it comes to creating a marketplace, if I was to list a product as a service, I want as many people as possible to see that. I don't want to be the only person who can view that. So what we're actually going to do is delete this privacy setting. We don't want it. So we're going to head to our trash can icon, click the delete option, and then we can get rid of that. Back in our data types tab though, there is something else we'll need to add in before we build out all of our data fields. So if I jump back into Notion here and scroll on down, you'll see below our data types, I also have this list of what's known as option sets. Now, just when you thought you were confused enough already, I'm going to throw another spanner in the works. And look, I am sorry to do that, but option sets are something that I really do need to teach you within this tutorial, as it's going to make your life so much easier within Bubble. And if you're relatively new to Bubble or you've never used option sets, you can kind of think of option sets like a data type. So as I mentioned, every single time a user wants to create something, that needs to be a data type because they're creating that entry in our database. But what happens if we as the admins of our application would like to store some information within our app that only we can create, not any users? And so a great example is something like our profile types. So as I mentioned, within our application today, I only want users to have one of two profile types. They can either be a freelancer or they can either be a business. And so I wouldn't create a data type which is known as profile types because I don't want users to create their own special type of profile. I only want them to choose from one of the two options that I'm providing. And that is the power of option sets. They're kind of just like a pre-built data type that just allow you to store information that you want and also information that your users can't edit. And personally, I use option sets in a lot of my drop-down menus. So let's say if a user was registering a new account and we wanted them to select from a profile type, what we could do is add a drop-down menu that references the two options that we've already created. So that way they can only select between a freelancer and a business. They can't just make themselves whatever they want. And you'll see I've also done that with things like the categories. So whenever someone wants to list a product or a service, they're going to have to link that to a category. And I only want them to select from a list of categories that I'm in control of. Because if a user wanted to create a category every single time they listed a product, there's no guaranteeing that they're going to first of all spell it correctly. Or we also can't guarantee that they're just going to add in a duplicate version of an existing category. And so if I, as the admin of my application, am in control of the categories that someone can select from, I can just ensure that there's an orderly peace kept throughout my app. And that way users can't interfere with the whole experience. And so in order to create an option set, what we're going to do is jump over into our Bubble editor, and within our top menu here, you'll see this option to add in option sets. Now, Bubble also does provide an additional tutorial here if you wanted to understand option sets in a little bit more detail. So if you're still a little confused, I'd recommend checking that out. And look, I promise my feelings won't be hurt if you watch another tutorial. What I'm going to do though is skip this tutorial. And now what you'll see is that the process of creating an option set is relatively similar to the process of creating a data type. So on the left-hand side here, we have the ability to add a name for a new option set. And as I mentioned, the first option set I want to add in is the profile types. Now, when it comes to option sets, I will allow you to use a plural. because within each entry, we are creating all of the items at once. And so what we're going to do is jump into Bubble and we're going to create an option set here. And I'm going to call this profile types. And now once we add that option set in, you'll see that this is even going to look more like the process of creating a data type, in the sense that on the right-hand side here, we now have the ability to add in things like a data field. So this is all of the information we're going to store within our profile types. Thankfully though, this is super straightforward. All I'm going to add in is my 2 options. So first of all, there was the freelancer profile, and then there was the business profile. Now, what I also love about option sets is that you have the ability to customize as much data as you would like to store within this option set list. So if you wanted, you could store images within each option, or you could even store files. But look, I won't confuse you with that because we don't need to use it today. One thing I will just point out though is that if you ever want to reference the options within this list, this text here, so our different options, are referred to as the display text. So this is the text that's going to display within our list. Now, please just keep that in mind because we are going to reference that later on throughout our tutorial. But from here, the next thing I'd like to do is just jump back into my checklist, and I'm going to add in my list of options for my categories. So if we go into Bubble, I'm going to add an option set called categories. And from here, I'm just going to add in all of the items I had within our list. So this is things like AI artists, logo design, social media. So if I just jump into Bubble, I'm going to create this, AI artists. You can see I have a small typo. I'll fix that and create this. Then there was logo design, social media. And then after we've added social media in, let's see what else was on our list. So there were things like voiceover, SEO, translation. So we'll add in voiceover, SEO, translation, and I know the other one was data entry. So that is all of my options here. Now, this is just a small list of categories that I wanted to add in our tutorial today. But if you ever wanted to add a long list of categories, so anything else like software developing or different categories of data science or digital marketing, this is where you can add those in. So feel free to pause this tutorial and add in whatever options you would like. For now though, I'm just going to jump back into Bubble because if I scroll on down, there's one last option set list I'd like to create, and that is known as our order status. So let's say if a business owner purchases a product or a service from a freelancer, the freelancer should be able to update the status of that order based on that project. So has it been ordered? Is it in progress? Or is it complete? Now, once again, the reason why I've created these as an option set list is so that way I can ensure some continuity between all of the statuses that a freelancer selects. And so if you really wanted within your application, you could filter a list of orders that are currently in progress or even complete. But of course, all of those values will need to match. And so instead of giving the freelancer the discretion to type in whatever options they want, I want to be in control of the 3 options they can select from. And so that's just going to ensure consistency within our app. So if we just jump back into Bubble and within our option sets list, I'm going to call this order status. And then from here, I'm going to add in the 3 options. So the first is ordered, then there was in progress, and finally there was complete. And that is all we'll need to create for all of our option sets here. I know we've kind of diverted off the path, but the reason why I wanted to create our option sets first before we build out all of our data fields is because what you'll see is that some of our data fields actually link to our option sets. So for instance, if a user is a freelancer, I'd like to store a list of categories that they list as their skills. And so what they could do is store a list of all of the category items within our option set list. So this is where you can really start to see the power of Bubble come to life. It truly does allow you to create what's known as a relational database. So it just means that you can create relations between everything connecting in your database. And look, I won't confuse you with more details because I already feel like I've confused you enough. But the last thing we'll need to do within this step of our tutorial today is build out all of the data fields that are going to sit under each data type. So I'm going to walk through these and I'm going to explain the purpose of each of these as we add them into our app. So if we jump over into Bubble, the first data type we're going to build out the fields for is our user data type. So we'll jump to our data types tab, open up our user data type, and it's at this point that we can create our very first field. Now, the first field I want to store is going to be the user's name. And when you create a new field, what you'll see is that you also have the option to select how you want to format this data in your database. So is it going to be a text field? Are we going to store an image, a file, or even a date? And look, thankfully, this one's pretty straightforward. It's just going to be a text field. I'll create that. Then I'm going to create another field, which is known as our about. So you can kind of think of this like the bio for someone. And this field type will once again just be a text field. It's super straightforward. I'll create another field, and I'm going to call this profile photo. Now, one thing you may have noticed here is that when I added in two separate words, I've just separated these with a dash, not a space. And the reason why I've done that is because I like to clearly separate my data fields from my data types. So when we reference data in our database in a moment, you'll be able to clearly see that anything with a dash is a data field, whereas any two words with the space is a data type. Now, it's just a personal preference of mine, but it's not completely necessary. But I do just think it's worth highlighting that in case you'd like to follow along. Now, for our profile photo, this field type is going to be an image because someone's going to upload a picture of themselves. We'll choose to create that. I'd also like someone to store their personal website. So I'm going to create a data field called personal website. And within this field, I'd like to store a URL, which thankfully is just plain text. So someone can add in the link to their own personal website, and then later on we can build out a workflow that'll send someone through to that website. But the way we're going to format that link is just using plain text. It's not going to be overcomplicated. I'll then choose to create this. Now from here, this is where things are going to get interesting. The next field we're going to create is known as the profile type. And this is where we're going to create our first linked field. So for this profile type, as I previously mentioned, I only want someone to be able to select from the two options I added within our option set list. And so if we head to this field type and scroll on down, you'll see the option to link this to our profile types option set. So I'm going to do that, and I'll choose to create this. Now, what we can also do is set a default value for what someone's profile type should be whenever they sign up an account within our app. And I'm actually going to set this to be the business type. I'm only going to switch someone to become a freelancer if they actually choose that they want to be listed as a freelancer in our marketplace. And of course, I'll show you how we can do that in a dedicated module. But for the time being, whenever someone signs up, they're just going to be registered as a business, which just means they'll be able to purchase services from our marketplace. The next field I'd like to create here is just going to be a list of all of the skill categories that a freelancer could contain. And of course, this field is going to be linked to our option set list. So I'm going to call this field name skill categories, and I'm going to link this field, as I mentioned, to our categories option set. So someone can select from all of the items on that pre-existing list. However, someone might have more than one skill category that they want to specialize in. So what we can do is tick this option here to select that this should be a list with multiple entries, which just means that someone can then add a list of specialized categories to their profile. We'll choose to create this. And now finally, the last thing we'll need to do is create a link between our user data type and our business details data type. Because as I mentioned, if someone wants to store the details of their business, I want to actually split that data off into a separate data type. So that way we're not storing all of that information under our user. And so in order to create a link between our user and our business details, we can create a field here, and I'm going to call this business details. And I'm going to link this field type to our business details. It truly is as simple as that. So now we've created a relational value between those two data types. And you'll see that come to life when we actually build out the feature to display someone's details. But for the time being, that's all of the data fields we'll need to add under our user data type. So we're going to jump to our Notion checklist, tick all of those fields off. Then we're going to scroll on down to our business details. And if someone does want to store the information about their company, we're going to need to obviously store some additional data fields. So if we jump into Bubble, open up our business details data type, the first thing I'd like to store is the business name. So I'm going to create a data field known as business name. And similar to the name under our user data type, this is just going to be a text field. I'll create this. Then I'd like to create another field known as the description for this business. So this is just like a short one-sentence bio about the business itself. And similar to the About section under our user data type, this is just going to be a text field. It's super straightforward. I'd also like to store a business logo. So this is like the profile photo for a business. So this field type is going to be an image. I can create that. I'll also add a dedicated field known as the website. So similar to someone's personal website, this is actually going to link to a business website. And this field type will once again just be a plain text field. And the last few data fields I'd like to add is, first of all, the number of employees. So when a business stores the details about themselves within a settings page, I'd just like them to be able to select how big their company is. And contrary to what you might think, this field type is just going to be a text field, not a number. And the reason why I'm selecting this as a text field is because I'm going to allow someone to select from a series of ranges. So those ranges could be something like 0 to 10 employees, 10 to 20 employees, 20 to 100, and so on. Whereas a number would only allow you to add in a specific count. So I'm just going to set this to be a text field. I'll create this. And then finally, I'm also going to create another field which allows a company to store their organization type. And this field type is going to be a text field as well. And just like that, that is all of the data fields we'll need to add to our business details. So we can jump into Notion, tick those off, and we can move on down to our product data type. So every single time a freelancer wants to list their services, they're going to create a new product in our database. And of course, as I mentioned, we're going to store some information about that product. So things like the title of it, the description summary, and a featured image, and so on. So if we jump into Bubble, open up our product data type, the very first field I'd like to store is going to be the title. So this is the name of the product. This will also be a text field, similar to our previous name fields. We'll create this. The next field is going to be known as the description summary. So this is just going to be a short one-sentence description of the actual product. And we're actually going to pull that from the full description of the product, which is a separate data type. But I won't confuse you with the details on that now, but I'll be sure to highlight that when we walk through that process. This field type is just going to be a text field though. It's super straightforward. Then I'd also like to create a field known as the featured image. So this is the main image for the product that's going to display on our homepage or our search results page. And of course, because we're storing an image, this field type will also need to be an image. We will create that. Then for each product, I'd also like a freelancer to link this to a category. So I'm going to create a field here known as a category. And I'll link this field type here to be our categories option set. So now they'll only be able to select from the pre-existing categories that we've created. Now in my example today, I'm just going to leave this as a single category. But if you wanted to store multiple categories, you could select that this should be a list. I'm just going to keep this as one though. I'm going to choose to create that. I'd also then like to create a data field known as the price. So this is how much the freelancer is going to be charging for that service. Now this field here is in fact going to be a number. And the benefit to selecting a number is that it actually allows you to perform calculations. And the other main benefit is that with numbers, you can actually format those as currencies, which is going to be perfect for our price field. So I'm going to choose to create this. And finally, the very last data field is just going to be a link we'll need to create between our product and our separate product details. So of course, as I've mentioned, our product details data type is where we're going to be storing all of the larger files. But we will need to create a way to link these two data types together. So under our product, I'm going to create a field called product details. I'll then set this field type to be linked to our product details. And just like that, we now have a link between our two data types. If we jump back into our Notion checklist, we can tick all of those fields off, and we're starting to work our way towards the end of the list. The next fields we'll need to add in is within our product details, and this one is super straightforward. So if we just jump into Bubble once again, open up our product details data type, we can create a new field here called full description. So unlike our description summary, this field here is going to display a long string of text. And this is where a freelancer can highlight all of the benefits to using their service, or of course, what's actually included in that service. Now, thankfully, this field type is super straightforward. It's just a text field. We can create this. And the last field we'll need to add is known as the images. So this is where a freelancer can update any additional images they want to display on their product page that we're going to build out. So this field type is going to be linked to an image, but of course, as the name would suggest for this field, I want to store multiple images, not just one. So I'm going to tick this option to store this as a list with multiple entries. We can then choose to create that, and that is all we'll need to add for our product details. So if we just jump back into Notion, we'll tick those off. And then as we work our way down the list, the next fields we'll need to add are within our order data type. So every single time a business owner purchases something from a freelancer, we're going to create an order in our database. And of course, for each order, just for historical purposes, we're going to need to store some information about what product they purchased, who the person was that they purchased it from, and what is the status of that order. So is it currently in progress or is it complete? And so in order to store all of that information, we'll jump into Bubble, open up our order data type, and the very first field we'll create is the product. So this is linking this order to a specific product that's been purchased. So if we scroll on down our field types, we're going to link this to our product data type. I'll then choose to create this. From here, I'll then select to create a field known as the freelancer. So if someone was to purchase an order, who is the freelancer that they're buying this service from? So this field type here is going to be a user, because of course it is our user who will be the freelancer. So I'm going to choose to create that. And then finally, we're going to create one last field, which is known as the status of this order. And as I mentioned, this will be linked to our predetermined order status option set. So that means it can be one of three options. It can either be ordered, in progress, or complete. And if we actually create this, I'm going to set the default value to be ordered. So whenever an order is created in our database, the status will be marked as this. And then of course, it's up to the freelancer to then update the status of this as they work through that project. But that's all we'll need to create here. So if we jump back into Bubble, we can tick those off, and we only have a few remaining data types. The next one is our reviews. So as I previously mentioned, after an order is complete, the business owner might like to leave a review for a freelancer. So if we jump into Bubble, open up our review data type, there's a few bits of information I'd like to store within each review. First of all, there's the rating of the review. So this is going to be how many stars should it receive. And this field type here is actually going to be a number, because I would like to perform some calculations on reviews later on. And so if this is a number, we could, for instance, calculate the average star rating for a freelancer. So I'm going to set this rating field as a number. I'm also then going to create another field known as the content of the review. So this is where a business owner could add something like a comment. So this is just going to be where they store some text. And so for this field type, it's just going to be text. It's super straightforward. I then also like to link this field to a freelancer. So that is the person who is receiving this review. Now, similar to our previous field where we linked it to a freelancer, this field type is going to be a user. So we've created a link between that data type. And finally, I'd also like to create one last link for this review, and that is to a specific order. So that way a freelancer can find out what this order was that they received that review for. So I'm going to create a new field here, and I'm going to call this order. And this, of course, will be linked to our order data type. We will create that, jump back into Notion, check off that we've finished building out those data fields, and the last two list of fields we'll need to add in is for our chat data type and our message data type. And thankfully, these ones are super straightforward. So for our chat data type, within each chat, I'm going to store a list of 2 users. So that's obviously going to be the business owner as well as the freelancer. So if we jump into Bubble and open up our chat data type, I'm going to call this users. And as you would imagine, this field type is going to be linked to our user data type. And because there's going to be 2 users within this chat, I'm going to tick that this should be a list with multiple entries. I'll choose to create that. And that's all we'll need to create for this data type. It truly couldn't be any simpler. The last data fields we'll need to add in is for our message. And thankfully, messages are pretty straightforward to create as well. If we jump into Bubble, open up our message data type, the very first field I'd like to store is the content of the message. So once again, that's the actual text that someone types in that they want to send to someone else. So this field type is just going to be a text type. I'll create this. And then the very last bit of information we'll need to store for a message is a way to link this message back to an original chat. So let's say if there's a chat between two users. Within that chat, I'd like to display only all of the messages that are related to that specific chat. So what we can do under our message data type is create a field and call this OG chat. So this is the original chat that each message should belong to. And this field type will of course be linked to our chat data type. We'll create that. Then we can jump back into Notion and tick those items off from our list. Now look, that is everything we need to build out within this database. I do have to say, in comparison to some of my previous tutorials, this is a fairly large database. So please don't be overwhelmed. Not every application is this big, but there really is just so much that I want to cover within this tutorial today. So there was some additional data types I needed to create, as well as the option set list. But as you can see at this point in time, the process of creating a custom database wasn't entirely impossible. And of course, we did all of this without writing a single line of code. Now that we've finished setting up and configuring our entire database, we can move on down to the list of features I have set out for us in our Notion checklist today. And as you can see, this is quite an extensive list because there's so much that I want to cover within this build. The very first thing I want to build out though is going to be the home page of our Fiverr clone. And so if we were to model this off the real world Fiverr product, I just have a version of that opened up in a separate tab here. So if I was to jump over to that, what you'll see is that on the Fiverr website, there's this hero section at the top, which just displays an image of a freelancer, as well as some text and even a search bar. Then below this, we have a list of popular services, and these are displayed horizontally in a series of cards based on different categories. And then below this, they also display some additional information, but all of this is just static information. What I'd like to do today is add our own unique twist on this, and instead of displaying some of just these static fields, what I'd like to do is display a series of popular products from freelancers within our marketplace. But to get started, we're going to build out this hero section here. So if I was to just jump back into my Bubble editor, over in Bubble, I've opened up my index page, which is currently blank. Now the index page is the default home page inside of any Bubble application. So this is where we're going to be building out our home page today. Now the very first thing we'll need to do on this page is a little bit of housekeeping before we can start adding on all of the elements that are going to bring our product to life. And so the first thing I'd like to do is just double click on the page itself, and that's going to open up our property editor in Bubble. So our property editor, as the name would suggest, allows us to edit the details of any properties that we select on. So if we click on any elements inside of our editor, we have the ability to make changes to them there. Now, what you'll see within my property editor is that we've currently selected our index page. So that is the overall page you see here. And the first thing I'd like to do on this is actually just update the background color. So Fiverr as a product actually uses a light shade of gray as their background color. So I'd also like to update our background color to reflect that. And so what I'm going to do is head on down to our background style here and update the background color from white to this shade of gray that I have. If you'd like this color code, it's F7, F7, F7. And now you'll also be able to see where the page clearly sits inside of our overall Bubble canvas. So it just makes it easier to interpret. The other thing I'll need to do when I'm working in any page inside of Bubble is update the container layout of that page. Now, if you're new to Bubble, the container layout will just determine in which order elements will be positioned on your page. And I'll be sure to explain this in more detail. So if we jump over to this layout tab here within our property editor, we'll see this menu here, which is known as our container layout, as I just mentioned. And if we were to open this drop down, you're going to see 4 different options. Now, contrary to there being 4 different options, I personally will only ever use 2. And that is either the option of a row or a column. Now, the easiest way to explain and perhaps interpret the difference between these 2 options is that if you were to select the row option here, it would position any elements you add onto the page horizontally across the page itself. And perhaps I should just show you an example of this. So if I was to just randomly add 2 different buttons onto my page here, so I've just added one and then I made a copy of it. I'm going to then select on my page again, head to my layout tab and update the container layout to be a row. And now what you'll see is that both of these elements are positioned side by side. So they're scaled horizontally across our page. However, the other option within our container layout drop-down menu here is a column. Now, a column will do the opposite to a row. So it's going to position elements vertically across your page. So it's going to place them from top to bottom. And so when you're working on any page or group elements inside of a page, and I'll be sure to explain what groups do in a moment, these are the only two options I'll ever choose from. I don't ever really have a need for the other two options, so you don't need to worry about those right now. And now when it comes to the overall container layout of the page itself, in 99% of cases, I will always use the column option, because when you think of any modern applications, whether they be on web or mobile, the page is built from top to bottom. It's not like a book where you read it from left to right, you read it from top to bottom. Now, of course, there will be sections on any page where you will need to display elements horizontally across your page. But in terms of the overall page structure, everything should be positioned from top to bottom. So I'm going to set the container layout today to be a column. I'm then also just going to delete these buttons here because I no longer need those for my example. But from here, if we were to try and replicate the real world Fiverr product, we're going to add our hero section onto the page. So this was the section at the top of our page that displayed an image, as well as this search bar. Now, in a separate module, I am going to explain how we can create a navigation menu, but just for right now, I want to focus on this particular hero section. And so when I look at this hero section on Fiverr, what I can see is that this text element and this search bar almost sit inside of this image here. And so in order to replicate this experience, we're going to need to use an element in Bubble known as a group. So if I just jump back into my Bubble editor here, what you'll see under this containers menu is an element known as a group. And if I was to just position this on my page, it just looks like a blank square. In reality though, groups are a very powerful element you're going to use a lot throughout your experience with Bubble. You can kind of think of groups like a mini page inside of your overall page. And the reason for that is because groups have their own container layout. And so let's say I had a container layout for my overall page that was a column, but I wanted to display some elements horizontally in one section. What you could do is actually add a group element onto your page, and you could set its container layout to be a row, remembering that that positions elements from side to side. And then any elements you add inside of this will have a separate container layout from the overall page itself. So to my point, I like to picture groups as a page inside of a page. Now, the other reason we're going to be using a group for this section of our page today is because similar to a page, they have the ability to update their background color. And when we're doing that, we can actually not just choose a color, but we can upload a background image. So that's where we're going to get that hero image from today. But before we upload that image, I'm just going to take care of some housekeeping here. So the first thing I'd like to do is just update the name of this group on my page. So if I click on the name field within my property editor here, I'm just going to update this to be called Group Hero. So that way when I view this in my elements tree, so this is where you can see all of the elements on your page, I know that if I ever want to click on the group at the top of my page, I'll know that it's called the Group Hero. Once I've updated the name, I'll also need to update the container layout. Now, if we were to jump back into the real world Fiverr product and just take a look at how this group is structured, what you'll see in this group is that the background obviously has an image to it, but inside of this we have some text followed by a search field. And now if we think about it, these two elements are actually placed on top of each other. So they're stacked vertically, which means that we're going to have to set the container layout of this group to also be a column. So if I jump back into my Bubble editor, I'm going to update the container layout to once again be a column. And then from here, we'll need to update the responsive settings for this element. So at this point in time, this group just takes up a small square on our page, whereas I want this to take up the whole width of our page, and I want it to be fully responsive across any device. And so in order to do that, within your layout tab, you'll see the options to update the width and height of any element. And at this point in time, this group has a fixed width of 280 pixels. And what that means is regardless of the page's size, so whether or not this page is being displayed on desktop or mobile, this group will always be only 280 pixels in width, no greater and no smaller. So it's always going to be this size. And now that's not the experience we want to create today. We want this group to be fully responsive to our page. So we want it to expand and shrink based on the actual size of the page itself. And so what I'm going to do is unselect this option to make this a fixed width. And what we'll now see is that we have the option to add in a minimum and a maximum width. And by default, the maximum width is going to be infinite, which just means that this group is going to take up as much space as it can on our page. So that's why it's now stretched across the entire width of our page. Now, when we're building fully responsive applications inside of Bubble, There's a particular setting you're going to hear me use time and time again throughout this tutorial today, and that is the value we should also set for our minimum width. So if I was to set the minimum width here to be 0 and leave the maximum width to infinite, that just means that regardless of how small or large the page is, this group here is going to be fully responsive. Because if its minimum width is 0, it can shrink down to literally 0 pixels. Whereas at the same time, if its maximum width is infinite, it can scale up to whatever size the page needs to be. And if we were to jump into our responsive tab here, what you'll see is that if I was to scale this page out, or if I was to shrink this page down, this group will always match the same dimensions of the page at any point in time. So that's how you can create a truly responsive experience inside of Bubble. So you're going to hear me reference this particular setting a lot today, and that's the minimum width of 0 with the maximum width of infinite. But just jumping back into my UI builder here, where we're going to actually build out this group, what we can now do is upload the background image we're going to use inside of this group. And then we're going to come back and update the height settings of this group. So if I jump over to my appearance tab, what I'm going to do is choose to remove the style of this group. And for the background style, I'm going to select that this should be an image. And now it's at this point that I'm going to upload an image that I have on my local device. But if you'd also like to get access to that image, I've uploaded all of the assets we're going to use today in a Google Drive folder. I'll be sure to include a link to this in the description of this video. But today we're going to be using this hero image asset that I've already uploaded into this file. So you can see that this is our picture of the freelancer themselves. And so if you download this, we're just going to jump back into our Bubble editor and we're going to upload this as a static image. So I'm just going to select this from my device. I'm going to choose to open this. And once that image is uploaded, what you'll see is that it's currently just being cut off here. And the reason for that is because the height of our group can't fit all of this image in. So that of course means we need to jump back to our layout tab here. And I'm just going to update one of the height settings for this group. And the height setting is just going to be the minimum height. So this minimum height is just telling Bubble that this group here should be at its smallest possible size, 280 pixels. Whereas what I'm going to do is update this to be 500 pixels. And the reason why I'm selecting 500 is purely just a personal preference. There's no science behind this. I just think 500 pixels is enough to display the full image of this person, as well as of course give me enough space to add in all of the elements I need on the left-hand side here. Now that's the only setting I'll need to change for my height. What we can now do is add all of our elements inside of this group. So if you remember, a group is kind of like a mini page inside of your overall page, which means of course you can add elements inside of it. And the very first element I'd like to add in is going to be that text element above our search field. So I'm going to head to my visual elements. I'm going to add a text element inside of my group here. And if I was going to replicate the exact same text from the real world Fiverr product, I'm just going to update this to display the words "Find the perfect freelance services for your business." And from here, we can't really see the text, so I'm just going to update the styling of this. I'm going to choose to remove the style here. And the first thing I'll do is update the font color to be white, so that way I can actually see this text. I'm also going to choose to update the font size to be 36. And I'll also choose to bold this text. Then from here, what I'd like to do is just update the responsive settings of this text element, as well as of course where it's positioned inside of our group. So if we jump over to our layout tab, I'm going to, similar to before, make this element fully responsive, which means I'm going to need to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width here to be 0, and I'm going to leave the maximum width to be infinite, which of course means that this element can take up as little or as much space as it needs on my page. And as you'll see, it's scaled completely across the full width of our page. But if we were to go and take a look at the real world Fiverr product one more time, the text on the Fiverr website is actually broken down into 2 lines, and it just fits within this small section here. And that is of course something we can replicate. So if we jump back into our own Bubble editor, what I'm going to do is open up our appearance tab for this text. And I'm going to choose to open this option, which is known as the rich text editor. And this rich text editor option is just going to allow us to update some additional formatting settings for this text. So this is just more around the actual way this text is stylized. And what I'm going to do is at the word services here, I'm going to click before that and I'm going to hit enter and I'm going to move that to a new line. And the other thing I'd like to do here is just update the font that's used for the word freelance. And the reason for that is because if we were to jump back into the real world Fiverr product, you'll see that the word freelance here is in a different type font to the additional text. And so this is once again an experience that we can recreate inside of Bubble. And the way I can do this is by opening up my bubble editor, and if I highlight just this word here, and then select on the font options. And if I scroll on down to the option which is known as serif, I probably butchered the name of that. However, what you'll see is that it's going to update the font style for just that word. Now, if I choose to save this, what you'll now see is that this text looks more like the actual real-world Fiverr product. But of course, we just need to update its position on our page. And so if we jump back to our layout tab once again, there's just a few additional settings we're going to need to change. And if we scroll right down to the bottom here, you'll see the option to add in some margins around this element. So if I was to add in 150 pixels of margin at the top, as well as 50 pixels of margin on the left and 50 pixels of margin on the right, what you'll see is that this element is going to be pushed down into the center of our group. Now, what I can also notice is that at this point in time, this text element, because it has a maximum width, it's still scaled across the full width of our group, minus the 50 pixels of margin we've just added. So what I could actually do is just move my property editor up and select this option to fit the width of this element to the content inside of it. Now, what that's going to do is still give this element a maximum width of infinite. So if we were to type more text into this, it would continually expand out. However, by ticking this option, I've just let this text element know that it should collapse around the width of this text. So that just means that it's going to fit nice and snug around all of the text here. And what you might actually notice is that by default, the option is selected to do the same thing for the height of this text. And that's just going to mean that there's not any empty space at the bottom of this text element. And just to be sure that any additional empty space won't appear, what we could also do is update the minimum height here to be 0. So similar to our width settings, we could have a minimum of 0 and a maximum of infinite, which just means that this element is going to be as small or as large as it needs to be around this text. And just like that, that is how we can build out the text element within our hero section. I know there was quite a bit involved with this, particularly if you are new to Bubble. This is a lot to take on board. But right now, you can really start to see our homepage come together quite nicely. The next thing we'll need to add though is the search bar that sits below this. Now, although the search bar does sit directly below this text, what you might notice is that next to the search bar is this button here. So technically this input field and this button are two separate elements. And these are actually positioned side by side, not on top of each other. And so within our overall group here, how could we position two elements side by side? And the answer to that is we could add another group inside of our existing group, and we could set its container layout to be a row, not a column. So if we jump back into our bubble editor, what I'm going to do below this text is add in another group element. So if we head to our containers menu, I'm going to choose to add a group in. And what you'll see is because we've added this group inside of our overall group, which of course the original group had a container layout of a column, this group will still be positioned below our text element, which is exactly what we wanted. But inside of this new group, what we could do is update the container layout to be a row. And what that's going to mean is that any elements inside of this group, so kind of like this mini page, are going to be positioned horizontally, so side by side. Now, while we're working on this group, what I might actually do is head over to my appearance tab and just remove the style of this. And a personal preference of mine when I work with groups is that I like to give them a flat background color, and I can make this something really noticeable. So I can make it like a light shade of red. And the reason for this is because when you're stacking group elements onto your page, if they are all the exact same color, or if they don't have a background color at all, you can quickly lose track of where all of those groups lie on your page. And so by taking the time to color code my groups, it kind of makes it seem like I'm working with Lego blocks. So I'm just adding all of these colorful sections together. And of course, whenever you go to preview or publish your application, you can just set the background style to be none, and it will just remove that bright color. But for the time being, I'm going to leave the background style as a flat color. I'm also then just going to jump to my layout tab here, because the very first thing I'll need to do is update the responsive settings for this group before I add any elements inside of it. So I'm going to, like always, unselect that this should be a fixed width, and I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0 and leave the maximum width to be infinite, which just means that this group can take up as little or as much space as it needs on my overall page. Then inside of this, before we come back and update all of the height settings, I'm going to add my two elements inside of this group. And the very first element I'd like to add into this group is just going to be a standard input field that someone can type in. So if I scroll on down in my elements tree to my input forms, I'm going to grab a standard input field. And before I make any changes to this input field, the first thing I'm going to do is update the name of this. And the reason for that is because when I build out a workflow to make this input field functional, I want to be able to quickly and easily reference the actual input itself. And so if I was to call this something like input search, I then know that this is the search bar on my page, so I can quickly reference it. Now for this input field, I'm also going to update the style of this. So I'm going to remove the default style. I'm going to scroll on down and update the background style to have a flat color. And I'm just going to leave this as white. The other thing I'd like to do for this input field is just update the roundness of its borders. So because this input field is going to sit directly next to a button, what I'm going to do is actually remove the curved edges on the right hand side. So if I scroll on down within my appearance tab, you'll see this option next to your borders here, which is known as the roundness of all your borders. And so right now it's set as a 5. Which is quite fine, but what I want to do is just tick this option to define each border independently, which just means that now I can choose the roundness of each individual border within this input field. And so for the top left, I'd like to set this to be 5 once again. For the top right, however, which is this side here, I'm going to set this to be 0 because I don't want that to have a curved edge. For the bottom right, I'm also going to set that as 0, but for the bottom left, I'm going to set that to be 5. So I'm just going to type in the number 5 there. And that's all I'll need to change within the appearance tab for this input field. But of course, what I'll also need to do is make this fully responsive. So if we jump over to our layout tab, by this point in time, you've probably guessed exactly what I'm about to do here. So right now, as it stands by default, this input field is set to be a fixed width of 250 pixels, which just means that regardless of the page size, no matter how big or small it is, this is always going to be 250 pixels. So this exact size here. And now that's not the experience I want to create. I want to make this input field expand or shrink based on the size of our page. So of course, in order to do that, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width of infinite. And what you'll now see is that it's going to take up as little or as much space as it can within this red group. So it looks quite long right now. And don't worry, we're going to fix that in a moment. I'm also just going to update the height of this input field while I'm here. So right now it's fixed at 48 pixels, and I'm completely fine with the height being fixed because someone's only ever going to type in a few words into this field. So I don't need this element to expand vertically. So it's completely fine with the default option. Just a personal preference of mine though is that I like to set my height to be 45 pixels. By all means, it's not necessary to change that. You can leave it at 48, but I just like to use 45 myself. Now, next to this input field, what I'd like to do is add a button element into this group. And that button element is going to be our search button, which when clicked, later on we're going to build out a workflow to power a search feature. And so in order to add a button element onto our page, we're going to scroll on up to our visual elements. We're going to add a button element into our group. And the first thing you'll notice is that this button element sits directly beside our input field. And that's because the container layout of this red group is of course set to be a row, which just allows them to be positioned horizontally. Now for this button, I'm going to need to make quite a few changes to the styling of it. The first thing I'd like to do though is just update the name of this. So I'm going to call this button search. So that way, of course, when I go to build out my workflow later on, I know that this is the button that's going to power my search experience. I'm then going to choose to update the style of this button. And in order to do that, I'm actually not going to remove the style. Instead, I'm going to edit the default style here. Now, up to this point, I haven't really explained too much about styles in Bubble, but essentially, let's just say that I want to make this button the same green color that Fiverr uses. And instead of having to change the color to be green every single time I want to add a button anywhere in my app. So let's say on another page of my application, I want to add yet another button. And if I want that button to be the same green color as this button here, instead of having to customize the style each individual time, what you can do is you can reference a style saved in Bubble, which just means that you create it once and you can reference those design settings at any point in time. And by default, Bubble's created 3 different styles for us here. And what we can actually do is choose to edit these styles. So if I select this option to edit the style of our primary button, whatever design settings we add here, that's going to be the default design settings for any other button used within our application. So I'm going to click this option to edit the style. And the first thing I'd like to do is just update the color of this button. I'm going to have this be a green color code that I have. If you'd like this, it's 1DBF73. And this is just the same green color code that Fiverr uses within their real world app. Now, the only other thing I'll need to change while I'm here is just the hover effect on this button. So at this point in time, you'll see in your button style, you have this conditional tab here, and this condition just recognizes when someone hovers over this button, in which case it just updates the background color. So if I was to turn this on and off, which you can do with this little toggle here, this is the color that this button will take whenever someone hovers over the button. So it just reverts back to the same blue color code as before. Whereas in this case, what I'd like to do is just update this with another green color code. So I'm going to paste in a darker green, which if you'd like this color code, it's OEA860. And what you'll now see is that when I toggle between these two greens, one is just a darker variation, whereas the main color is just a lighter version of that. Now that's all we'll need to change here. So if we jump back into our design tab, what you'll see is that our button element has now taken the same design settings as the style we've just edited. And so if we jump into our appearance tab, you'll now see it's still referencing the primary button style. What I'd like to do now though is just update the text that's displayed within this button. I'm going to have this display the word search. I'm then going to need to update all of the layout settings for this button. So if I jump over to my layout tab, now what you'll notice within my layout tab is that by default, this button is a fixed width of 150 pixels. Now, when it comes to buttons, I do normally tend to leave these as a fixed width, just because with a button element, in 99% of use cases, you'll always want it to be the exact size you create it as. However, in this case, I think that 150 pixels is just a little bit too long. So I'm going to set the width here to be 100 pixels, and I am still going to keep that as a fixed value. I can also see that the minimum height for this button is 45 pixels, which is perfect because if you remember, the height of our input field beside this is also 45 pixels. What I would just like to do though is move this button to the next position in our red group. So if I just move my property editor down and tick this option here to move this to the next position, this is just going to place this to the right side of our input field. And if I was to click away from this, you'll see that these two elements sit perfectly side by side. However, there's one minor thing I'll just need to change, and that is the borders around the left-hand side of my button here. And so what you'll see is that because the borders of my button are curved around every single edge, these just don't really line up with my input field perfectly. So what I could do is select on my button one last time, jump over to my appearance tab, and I know I just created a style that we're going to reference throughout our entire application. But what I'm going to do is choose to remove this style. And at this point, it's going to keep all of the same default settings of our primary button style. But because I'm just creating a one-off change here that I'm not going to use across my entire primary button style, what I want to do is just make that change directly on this button itself. And that change is, of course, updating the roundness of the borders for this particular button. And in this case, I'm going to define each of my borders independently. And for the top left border, I'm going to set that to be 0. For the top right, I'll set that to be 5. For the bottom right, that will be 5, and for the bottom left, that will be 0. And now if I was to click away from this, what you'll see is that these two elements sit perfectly side by side, and that is the exact experience we want to create. The last thing we'll need to do is just update the responsive settings for this red group, because at this time you'll see we not only have all of this empty space at the bottom of our red group, but it also takes up the entire width of our main group that it sits within. So if I click on this group here and jump over to my layout tab, the first thing I'd like to do is update the minimum height of this group. Now, as I'd mentioned in the past, by default, groups have this option selected to fit the height of the content to the elements inside of it. But because this group has a minimum height of 280 pixels, that's just telling Bubble that at minimum, it should be this exact height. Whereas if we were to set the minimum height to be 0, and this option is selected to fit the height around the content inside of it, it's going to collapse perfectly around all of the elements that sit within it. Now, the last problem that we have is with the width of this group, and that is of course because it takes up the entirety of our page right now. And the reason it's taking up the full width of our page is because the maximum width is set to be infinite. Whereas if I was to add a value into this field, so let's say I want to make this at max 500 pixels in width. So that just means that at the full potential size, this group can be no wider than 500 pixels. That's just going to collapse and shrink the overall size that it will take up on our page. Of course, because it has a minimum width of 0 though, if the page was to decrease in size, which I can show you in a moment, it's still going to be fully responsive. It just means that it's no longer allowed to be any wider than 500 pixels. Now the last thing we'll need to do is just add some margins around this group, so that way it's in line with the text element that sits directly above it there. And that is that I'm going to add the top margin here to be 20, and I'll set a left margin of 50 and a right margin of 50. So that way this group sits in line with the text element above it there. And now that is everything we'll need to change for this particular group. And if you ever find that you want to edit the settings of this group, so let's say I was to click away from this, what you'll see is that you're unable to actually select the group itself. And that's because the group is wrapped around all of these elements. So when I click inside of the group, it's obviously just going to click into our input field here. A quick trick for that is that if you were to right click on this input field, you'll see this option to select its first parent. And so the parent is the group that contains that element. And that is, of course, our red group. So that's how you can access and change all of these settings for that particular group. Now, at this point in time, that is how we can build out the hero section of our main website page. Of course, also this page is entirely responsive. So if I was to scale this out, it's going to look great. If I was to reduce the size of this, what you'll see is that all of the text element as well as the search field are also going to be completely responsive. If I really wanted, I could even just add in 20 pixels of margin at the bottom of this group. So that way it doesn't directly touch the bottom of our main group on our page. So if I jump to my UI builder here, double click on my input, right click on it and select its first parent. Under the layout tab, I could add in 20 pixels of margin on the bottom. Then in my responsive tab, what you'll see is that it's no longer going to touch the bottom of our main group. And I know that seemed like it took forever, but that is how you can build out the hero section of the Fiverr clone today. Now, in comparison to some of the other products that I built, this definitely did include a lot of details. And particularly given that this is the first section of our tutorial today, I wanted to make sure I covered that in as much detail as I possibly could. But I have great news for you. The next section is going to be just as difficult. And that is because the next section of our Fiverr clone on the homepage is just going to display this list of cards or tiles, which just represent all of the different categories that someone could search through for freelancing services. And the reason why this is so difficult is because it requires us to learn how to use an element known as a repeating group in Bubble. But of course, like always, I'm going to be sure to explain this in as much detail as possible. But one thing I should just point out is that on this list of categories, users are able to slide across this horizontally. So just keep that in mind as we build out the next section of our homepage here. So if we jump back into our Bubble editor, the first thing I'm going to do below our hero section is just add in a text element. So if I jump to my visual elements, I'll add a text element onto my page. And for this text element, I'm just going to have this display the words popular professional services. I'm then going to just remove the style of this because I'm going to create a one-off style. And for this text, I'm just going to set the font size here to be 26. I'll also choose to bold this text, and then I'll need to make this fully responsive, which of course means that I'll need to jump to my layout tab. When it comes to the width, like always, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. And if I set the minimum width to be 0, and if I set the minimum width to be 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite, of course it's going to take up as little or as much space as it can on my page. I'm also going to set the minimum height to be 0. And because we have this option selected by default to fit the height of this element to the content inside of it, it's going to collapse perfectly around all of the text. And then finally, I'm just going to add in some margins around this text element. I'm going to add in 30 at the top, 30 on the left, and 30 on the right. Now it's below this text element that we can add in the list of categories we'd like to display. Before we do that though, I'm just going to need to expand the height of my page down. So if I click on my overall page, so this is my index page, I'm just going to update the minimum height of my UI build here. I'm going to set that to be, let's say, 1500. And that's just going to give me some additional space to work within. And from here, what we can do is now add in a way to display a list of those categories. Now, whenever you're displaying a list of items in Bubble, there is a specific element that's going to do this, and this element is going to become your new best friend. And that element is known as a repeating group. So within your containers menu, we're going to add a repeating group element onto our page. And the first thing you'll see is that it kind of just looks like a spreadsheet in some sense. And that's because a repeating group allows you to display a list of items. So if you were ever building a feature like, let's say, an Instagram clone where you want to create a homepage feed, so that way you would display a list of photos or videos, a repeating group is the exact element you would use to do that. Essentially, what a repeating group does is pulls through a list of data from your database, and it can display all of those entries in whatever order you would like. So you can kind of create your own little algorithms on these repeating groups. And I know that might sound complex, but it is super straightforward. The reason why we're using a repeating group in this section of our homepage though, is because I'd like to display a series of categories that someone could search for freelancing products by. And so before you update any of the layout or design settings of a repeating group, what you'll actually need to do is jump over to your appearance tab and give it a data source. So if this repeating group is going to be pulling and displaying information from our database, we need to actually link that to the relevant data that we want to display. And so in this instance, the type of content I'd like to display isn't actually going to be a data type. Instead, it's going to be our list of option sets, which is known as our categories. So if I was to jump back into our data tab, you might remember under our option sets, we created this list, which was our categories. So this was things like our AI artists, our logo design, social media, and so on. And so what I want to do is display this list within this repeating group. And because all of this data is pre-populated in our database, it's nice and easy to do. So if we jump to our type of content, I'm going to reference the categories option set. And then after selecting the type of data we want to display within this repeating group, we need to give it a data source. So that just means that of the categories, which categories would we actually like to display? And in this instance, it's super straightforward. I'm just going to display all of the categories. It truly is as simple as that. Where things get complex is when it comes to the design and style settings of a repeating group. And the reason for that is because we have all of these settings here for the things like the number of rows, the number of columns, then plus you have all of the traditional settings within your layout tab. And particularly if you're new to Bubble, this can be super overwhelming. And please don't stress, it took me a long time to get the hang of repeating groups. Of course, what I'm here to do today though is to make things as easy as possible for you and hold your hand throughout that process. So the first thing we're going to do is jump over to our appearance tab, and we're going to unselect these two options. So right now, this repeating group is only going to display a list of 4 options because it has a fixed number of rows as 4. So let's say in our database, we had 8 categories. Right now, it would only display 4. So that's not the experience we want to create. So we're going to unselect that option to display a fixed number of rows. And what you'll also notice is that this repeating group has a fixed number of columns. So the columns is how many cells are on each individual line here. And so right now, as this current setting stands, there's 1 cell on each individual line, which just means that there are going to be multiple lines stacked vertically in our repeating group. And that's not the experience we want to create, because if you remember, the repeating group on the Fiverr homepage was actually positioned horizontally. So all of the tiles were positioned side by side. So I'm also going to unselect that this should be a fixed number of columns. Then from here, what we'll need to change is the actual size of the height and width for each individual cell. So with a repeating group, there's not only the overall size of the element itself, which is the rectangle you see on our page. Now, all of these settings related to the overall rectangle are located within our layout tab. And we're going to change these in a moment. But these settings within our appearance tab just refer to the height and width of each individual cell. And when it comes to the height and width of each individual cell, I'm actually going to set the height of each row to be 350 pixels. Now, the reason why I've selected 350 pixels is because it's purely just a personal preference. If I was to look at the page right now, I can see that the height of this repeating group is 350 pixels. And that is roughly the height that I want each individual category image to be. And the reason I got to 350 pixels is purely just through experimentation, but I'll show you how I got to 350 pixels once we upload an image into our repeating group. The other thing I would just like to change is the width of each column. Now, I'm going to set this to be 320 pixels. And the reason for this is a little bit more scientific than the guesstimation of our height. And so the best way to explain why I selected 320 pixels in width is by jumping over to our responsive tab here. Now, at the top of our responsive tab, you may have noticed before that we have these different configurations for sizes of different devices. So if we wanted to preview what this application would look like on a desktop, we can click this and it's going to update the size of our page to be 1200 pixels. And right at the very end, you'll see the option to view this on a mobile device, which is 320 pixels. Now, when it comes to most modern mobile devices, so I'm talking things like an iPhone 14, I personally find that the screen dimensions of these devices are a little bit bigger. So they'll normally sit at something like 380 pixels. But if someone's viewing this application on something like an iPhone 5, so let's say your grandma was using this app, the smallest possible device size for any mobile, so something like an iPhone 5, is going to be 320 pixels. So it's best to cater for the smallest possible use case. But then of course, because most elements and groups have an infinite maximum width, that just means that they can expand and take up the full page on a desktop. So that just means that at the minimum width of my repeating group, I'm only going to want it to be 320 pixels. So at the smallest possible size, that is the exact dimensions I want. So that's why I've selected 320 pixels for the minimum of each repeating group column here. Now, if I jump into my UI builder, double click on my repeating group and open up my property editor once again, before we can start to add all of our elements inside of this repeating group, we're going to jump over to our layout tab, because we now need to update the responsive settings of the overall repeating group, not just each of the columns that sit inside of it. And so when it comes to this repeating group, I'm going to update the container layout to be a column. Now, to be completely honest, I'm only going to add one element inside of this repeating group. So it doesn't really matter if you select row or a column. You're not going to be stacking elements at this point. But I'm personally just going to select the column option. I'm then going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. And I'm going to want to make this repeating group fully responsive. So if I set the minimum width to 0 and leave the maximum width to infinite, the actual repeating group element is going to take up as little or as much space as it can on our page. And what you'll now see is that at this point in time, it has room to fit in 3 different repeating group cells. And that is all I'll need to change for our width. For our height, I'm also going to leave this at 350 pixels because that's the same size that I used for the minimum height of each row. There is just one last change I'd like to make to this repeating group, and that is that I would like to update the scroll direction. So do you remember how I mentioned on the Fiverr homepage how you could scroll horizontally across all of the category tiles? It's at this point that we're going to update the scroll direction of this repeating group to not be that you should scroll down a list of these, but you should instead be able to scroll across this list. So I'm going to update the scroll direction to be horizontal. And from here, we can start to add in the elements we want to display inside of this repeating group. I'm sorry to sidetrack once again though, but I'm also just going to quickly update the background color of this repeating group. So that way I can clearly see where it sits on my page. So I'm just going to quickly jump to the style and remove the style of this. I will scroll on down to my background style and update this to be a flat color. And I might set this to be, let's say, a light shade of green, just so I can see where this actually sits on my page. Of course, when you go to preview or publish your app, just update the background style to be none, and it will remove this color. From here though, what I'd like to do is just add in all of the elements we're going to display inside of this repeating group. And if I just quickly jump back over into the real world Fiverr product, what you'll see within each of these cards is that they display a group, and then inside of that group, they display some text. And so when I look at each of these cards, I can kind of see that inside of our overall repeating group, we have another group element which has a background image on it. And then inside of that group, we just have a text element which displays the name of that category. So in order to build that out, we're going to jump back into our bubble editor. And we're going to scroll on down to our containers menu and add a group element into the very first cell of our repeating group. Now, what I love about repeating groups in Bubble is that you only need to design the very first cell, and then it will automatically populate across all of the remaining cells. And you'll see what I mean in a moment. But the first thing I'd like to do is update the background image of this group to reflect the background image of the relevant category that's being displayed inside of each repeating group cell. And so in order to reference the image of each category, the first thing I'll need to do is actually send through some data to this group. So because this group sits inside of a repeating group, which has a data source pulling through all of the categories in our database, I'd like to pass the data of each individual category through to our group. So if I select on the group here, I'm going to set the type of content to be a category. And then for the data source, I'm going to reference the option known as the current cells category. And so if I quickly just backtrack into the real world Fiverr product, if I was looking at this overall repeating group, you can see that we have a couple of different categories. So there's the AI artist, logo design, WordPress, voiceover, and so on. And so if we have a group within this particular cell of our overall repeating group, the group within this current cell would be the voiceover. So inside of this group, if I wanted to reference the title of that category, I would reference the current sales category because this is our voiceover group, as I just mentioned. And so that's what we're doing in Bubble. We're just creating a way to reference each individual category wherever they sit inside of our overall list of categories. And so if we just jump back into our Bubble editor, what we're now going to do is just display the background image for each of our categories. So in order to do that, I'm going to choose to just remove the default style of this group. And before I upload the image, I'm just going to actually give this a solid border for the time being. Now, this is purely just a personal preference of mine. And so what I actually like to do when I'm working with images, when I'm building out my app, is just add a solid border around them. So that way I can actually see where they sit. And as you'll notice, because I've added a border on this group here, any change made in this first cell will be reflected across any other cell inside of this repeating group. So to my point before, you only need to edit the first cell and the remaining cells will be pre-populated. I'm also just going to update the roundness of this group's borders to be 10, so that way it has some curved edges. And it's at this point that I'd now like to update the background image for each of our groups. So I'm going to update the background style to be an image, and I'm not going to upload a static image. Instead, what I'd like to do is reference this field here known as a dynamic image. So if we just jump over to our database quickly and open up our option sets and view the categories option set list we've pre-created, we've obviously already created this list of categories. So these are in our database. And if you ever want to reference information stored within your database, that is known as dynamic data, because you're dynamically going to allow Bubble to display all of this pre-created data. And so in this case, if we were to dynamically reference all of these individual categories, we obviously know the name of each category here, but how can we also reference a particular image associated with each of these categories? What you can actually do is create what's known as an additional attribute within your option set list. So by default, option sets allow you to just create the display text for each option. So that is just the name of all of the choices you see here. But just as another pro tip, if you were to create another attribute, which is kind of like a data field for your overall option set, you can store whatever additional information you'd like within each option. And so if I was to create a new attribute here, and if I called this attribute the featured image, I could set this attribute to be an image field type and create this. Then if I was to select to modify the attributes of each individual option, what you'll see is that I not only have the ability to update the title of this category, but I can also upload an image for this category. And of course, I've already taken the time to upload all of the relevant images into this Google Drive folder that I've given you access to. So what I'd recommend you do is just take the time to download these and then upload these to the relevant option set. So for our AI artist category here, I'm going to upload one of those images. Then once I've uploaded this image, I'm going to choose to save this. I'm then going to jump to our logo design and modify its attributes, from which I'm then going to upload the relevant featured image to that. I'll then choose to save this and I'll do the exact same thing for all of the additional categories. So I'm just going to take the time to upload all of the images now. I won't bore you to death by showing you the same repetitive process. So I'm just going to quickly pause this and do that now myself. But I'd also recommend you take the time to pause this tutorial and also just upload all of the relevant images into the applicable categories. So at this point, I've just paused the tutorial. I've uploaded all of my images. And now I'd like to actually display those images within my repeating group. So I'm going to jump back to my design tab. I'm going to click on my group, and under my appearance tab, I'm going to pull in some dynamic data for each of my categories. And so if I insert dynamic data, I'm going to reference the current cells category, remembering that in our first cell, that's going to be AI artist. The second one will be logo design and so on. So I'm going to reference the current cells category, the featured image, which is of course the image that we've just uploaded to each option. Now, just a personal preference of mine, when I'm working with images inside of a group or an image element, I also like to select this more option because I like to choose this option to process these images with ImgX. And what this just allows me to do is select this option here to resize the dimensions of each image by cropping it. And what that means is it's just going to expand the image out and make sure it takes up all of the space of this group. Now, this is just a personal preference of mine. It's not completely necessary, but it will create a much nicer looking application. So I'd always recommend to do that as well. And they're going to choose to close this data source. And from here, I'm just going to need to update the layout settings for this group before we then go and add a text element inside of it. So if I jump over to my layout tab here, I'm going to need to first of all set the container layout of this group. Now inside of this group, I'm going to once again just be adding in one element, which means that I can either choose from the row or the column option. It doesn't really matter. We're not going to be stacking elements, but for this case, I'm just going to choose the column option. While we're working on this group, I'm also going to horizontally align this in the center of our repeating group cell, which just means it's always going to be positioned directly in the center. Now, for the width of this group, contrary to what you might think, I'm actually going to leave this as a fixed value of 280 pixels. And the reason I'm doing that is because if you remember, each cell of our repeating group has a minimum width of 320 pixels. And that is, of course, the smallest possible size of any mobile device that could preview our app. And the reason I want to leave this as 280 pixels fixed is because if I was to add a margin of 20 pixels around every single border for this group, that now means that we have 20 pixels of margin on the left and 20 pixels of margin on the right. So if we were to get 280 and plus 20 plus 20, that gives us 320 pixels. So that's going to create literally the perfect responsive experience on the smallest possible device. And because our repeating group will continually scale across the page as someone's device size gets larger, it's just going to continually display more cells. Then from here, we'll just need to update the height settings of this group. And when it comes to the height, this one is a little bit of a tricky one, but I'm actually going to set the minimum height here to be 0. And I'm also going to unselect that this should fit the height of the content inside of it. And the reason I'm doing that is because I'd like this group to take up as much space vertically as it possibly can inside of this group. And you'll see why when I run a preview of this in a moment. But from here, that is all of the settings I'll need to configure for this particular group. So what I'd now like to do is just add in the very last element inside of this, which is just going to be a text element to display the title of each category. So if I scroll on up to my visual elements, I'm going to add a text element inside of this group. I'm going to insert dynamic data because I'd like to reference the name of this particular category. So if I choose this, I'm going to reference the parent group's category. Now, because this text element sits inside of a group, that group kind of takes care of this text element, which is why it's known as the parent group. And so if I'm referencing the parent group's category, I'm just going to choose the display text, which is of course the name of the actual category in our option set list. I'm then going to choose to remove the default style of this text element because I just like to update the font size here to be 20. I'm going to choose to bold this text and I'll set the color of this to be white. And then finally, I'm just going to need to update the responsive settings of this text. So I'm going to jump to my layout tab. Now, I'd also like to make sure that this text element is fully responsive inside of this group. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. And then I'm going to refer back to my previous settings, which is that I'm going to set the minimum width as 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite. So that just means that this text element can take up as little or as much space as it needs inside of this group. I'm also going to set the height here to be 0. And the reason for that is because we have this option selected by default, which just fits the height of this element around the text inside of it. So it's just going to wrap nice and snug around all of that text. And then finally, I'm just going to add in 20 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the left and 20 on the right. And that's just going to ensure that this text doesn't touch the borders of my image. Now at this point, what I actually want to do is just run a quick preview of my application to show you what this experience looks like. There are still a few minor tweaks we need to make to this repeating group, but I just want to show you what all your hard work looks like so far. So we're going to run a preview of this application. And what you'll see is that if you scroll on down, you have a list of all of your categories. So you can see the name of the category, the image, and you can scroll horizontally across all of these. But at this point in time, they're a little bit elongated. So they're quite stretched out and narrow. And so what we might do is actually add a maximum height on our repeating group, which just restricts how tall these actual cells can get. And so to do that, I'm just going to jump back into Bubble. I'm going to select on the overall repeating group itself. So this is my green element. And instead of having a minimum height of 350 pixels, I'm going to delete that. And I'm going to set the maximum height to actually be 350 pixels, which just means that the overall height of this repeating group is not allowed to be any larger than 350 pixels, which is this exact size here. So if I just jump back into Bubble, refresh my page here, and what you'll now see is that my images are no higher than 350 pixels, which makes them look much more like the real world Fiverr experience. And of course, we can scroll across these here. And if we were to reduce the width of our page, what you'll see is that it's going to cut these off but of course a user can still scroll across these. So regardless of their device size, they're always going to be able to review all of our categories. If I just open up my browser though, the very last thing I'd like to add onto our homepage, and I know we've already covered so much throughout this section of our tutorial today, is that I just want to add yet another repeating group, which is just going to display some of the featured freelancing products that are available within each of the categories. And the reason I'm doing this is because at this point in time, our homepage just contains 2 sections. It wouldn't hurt to add another one in. And so what we're going to do is jump back into our bubble editor here. And the very first thing I'm going to do is just make a copy of this text element that sits above our repeating group. I'll then click on our page and paste this in. I'll drag this down so that way this sits below our repeating group. And for this title, I'm just going to have this display the words popular gigs in search engine optimization, in brackets, SEO. And then obviously below this, I'm going to display a series of featured products that are related to SEO. Before I do that though, I'm just going to update the size of this font to be 20, not 26. So that way it's not as important as the featured text above our main categories. And now once we've finished adding our text element in, below this, what I'd like to do is display another repeating group. Only this time I'm going to be displaying a list of products, not categories. But in order to help streamline that whole process, what we're actually going to do is make a duplicate version of our existing repeating group. And the reason for that is because it's just going to save us a bit of time having to set up some of the initial settings. So I'm going to click on our green repeating group. I'm going to make a copy of this. I'm going to select on our page and paste this in. I'll then move this below our text element. And the first thing we'll need to do within this repeating group, similar to before, is update the data source. So at this point in time, this repeating group is displaying a list of categories, whereas I'd like this to display a list of freelancer products. So for our type of content we're going to search in our database for, I'd like this to display a list of products. Then what you'll see is that we need to update the data source here. So I'm going to right click on this, choose to clear this data, and I'm going to choose to perform a search in my database for all of the products that are related to the category of SEO. And so because our product is a data type, not an option set, products are obviously going to be created by users, not us, the admin of our application. So what we'll need to do is perform a search for all of the entries in our database. And these are entries that users are going to create. So we're going to search for all of the products where the category for these products equals, and I'm just going to select the SEO option. Because if you remember, this data field was linked to our option set within our database. And then from here, I'm just going to choose to sort these in a random sorting order, which just means that it's going to give an even amount of distribution to each of the products within this category. And that's all I'll need to set for this data source here. It's nice and straightforward. Now, when it comes to this repeating group, I am going to need to update the height of this. I don't want it to be as tall as the existing repeating group on our page. But before I do that, I just need to add another group inside of this repeating group because that's going to house all of the information. And then I'm just going to delete this existing group that we've added. We no longer need that. And so if we jump on down to our containers menu, we're going to add yet another group inside of our repeating group. And it's at this point that we can now select on our existing group and just delete this, from which we can then select on our new group here instead. Now, while we're working on this group, what I'd like to do is just first of all, remove the default style of this because I just like to give this a flat background color. And look, I'm happy to leave that as white. Now, because inside of this group, I'm going to be displaying all of the details related to a product within each repeating group cell, I'm going to need to pull some data from our actual repeating group into this new group, from which any elements I add inside of this new group are going to reference the data of the group itself. And look, I completely get it. What I said is probably super confusing if you're new to Bubble. So I think the best way to explain that is just by showing you. So if our repeating group is pulling through a series of products, I'm going to have this group here reference a data type of a product as well. Only the specific product it's going to display is going to be the current cell's product. So whatever product is within each individual cell of our repeating group. While we're in our appearance tab, I'm also going to update the roundness of this group's borders. Now, instead of having every border be the same roundness, I'm going to actually define each border independently. And for this group, I'm just going to update the bottom borders. I'm going to set the roundness of the bottom right to be 10 and the bottom left to be 10. And you'll see why I do that in a moment. I'm also going to need to jump over to my layout tab here. And because of course we're working with a group element, we're going to need to set the container layout of this group. And so inside of this group, I'm going to display a series of elements that are related to each individual product. So I'm going to display things like their featured image, the title of the product, who the person is that created it, as well as the description summary. And I'm going to be stacking all of these on top of each other, which means they're going to be vertical. So the container layout will need to be a column here. Once I've then updated the container layout, I'm going to horizontally align this group in the center of our repeating group cell. And when it comes to the width of this group, I can in fact leave this at a fixed value of 280 pixels. And the reason why I can do this once again is because if I was to select on the overall repeating group and head to the appearance tab, you'll remember that the minimum width of each column is 320 pixels. So if I then select on my group, jump to my layout tab, and if I was to add in 20 pixels of margin around each border of this group, which just helps me make sure it doesn't touch the borders of each repeating group cell, we now have 280 pixels of width for the group itself, plus 20 pixels of margin on each side, which means that 280 plus 20 plus 20, of course, equals 320. So this repeating group is going to be perfectly formatted for the smallest possible device size, which is a mobile. Now, in a moment, I am going to come back and update the height of this group. But before I do that, I'm going to need to add in all of the elements I'd like to display for this group. So as I mentioned before, the very first element I want to display for each product is just the featured image of it. So if I scroll on up to my visual elements, I'm going to add an image element inside of this group. And in order to reference the featured image for each individual product, I can choose to just insert dynamic data and reference the parent group's product. So that is the product stored within each group, the featured image. Now, because I'm working with an image, I'm also going to select this more option, and I'm going to choose to process this image with ImgX. So that way I can tick this option to resize the dimensions by cropping it. I'm going to choose to close this. Just a personal preference while I'm also working on images is that I'd like to remove the default style of this because I'd like to add a solid border around this image. And that solid border is just going to allow me to see where this actual image sits inside of my group. But obviously this image is far too big for this group right now. So we're going to head over to our layout tab and we're going to update the width dimensions of this image. Now in theory, because the group that this image sits inside of is going to be 280 pixels, and it's always going to be that value because it is a fixed width. We can just update the width of this image to also be 280 pixels, and it's going to fit perfectly inside of that group. One thing I would like to do though is just tick this option for this image to keep this element's aspect ratio fixed. And if I set this to be a 2:1 ratio, what you'll now see is that this is always going to be a rectangle. So it's going to fit our featured image in it quite nicely. And that's all we'll need to add for this image here. We don't need to add any margin around it. Below this though, what I'd like to display is the information of the person who has published this product. So that's just going to be the freelancer themselves. Now, when I'm displaying the information for this freelancer, I'd like to display their profile photo on the left and their name on the right, which just means that if I'd like to display two elements side by side, we need to add yet another group inside of our existing group and set that new group's container layout to be a row, not a column. So if I scroll on down to my containers, I'm going to add in yet another group here. And as I mentioned, I'm going to update the container layout for this to be a row because I'll be stacking two elements in this horizontally. Before I update any of the responsive settings here though, I'd just like to jump to my appearance tab because I'll need to do two things. The first is that I'll need to add a data source to this group. So because I want to display some information related to the person who published this product, I'm going to need to pass the data not only from my repeating group into my white group, but I'm also going to need to pass the data from my white group into this new group. So for the type of content, I'm going to reference the product from our repeating group, which of course at this point is just going to be the parent group's product as the data source because this new group sits within our white group. And of course, that group is pulling data from my repeating group. And look, I completely get it. I said the word group so many damn times that it probably confused the hell out of you. But if I was to just remove the style of this group and give it a flat background color and set this to be something like a light shade of red, you'll actually be able to see where this group sits inside of your overall page. And from here, what I can do is jump over to my layout tab and I can update the responsive settings of this new group. So what I'm going to do is unselect that this should be a fixed width, and I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite. So that way this red group can take up as little or as much space as it needs within our overall white group. Now, theoretically, I could also just leave this as a fixed width of 280 pixels. because if you remember, our main white group also has a fixed width of 280 pixels. So if you just wanted to keep things consistent, you could do that. But you also wouldn't be wrong if you just wanted to set a minimum and maximum width, because it's only going to take up as much space as it can within the white group. I will come back and update the height in a moment, but before I do that, I'm going to need to add my 2 elements into this group. So as I mentioned, the first element is going to be the profile photo of the person who has published this product. So that's going to be the freelancer. So if I jump to my visual elements, I'm going to head to our image element here. I'm going to add this into our cell, and I'm going to insert dynamic data. And if I want to reference the person who created this product, so the freelancer who has published it, I can select from the parent group's product, the creator of that product, which is a user. And now you'll see that I'm able to reference all of the data fields within our user data type. And in this case, I'd like to reference their profile photo. When I'm working with images, as I said, I'm always going to select this more option, and I'm going to choose to process images with imgix. So that way I can tick this option to resize the dimensions by cropping them. I'm also going to choose to remove the style of this image, so that way I can add a solid border around it. And for the roundness of this image, I'm going to set this to be 100, so that way it becomes a perfect circle. I'll then jump over into my layout tab here, because what I'd like to do is update the width of this image to be 30 pixels, and I'm going to keep this to be a fixed width, because at any given point in time, I only want this image to be 30 pixels, no smaller or no larger. What I'd also like to do is tick this option to keep this element's aspect ratio fixed, and I'm going to leave that at a 1:1 ratio, so that way it becomes a perfect square. And now you can start to see our images coming together quite nicely. What I'm also going to do is vertically align this image in the center of our red group, so that way I can also center the text that sits beside this, so they're always going to be perfectly in line. Then beside this image, I'm going to add in a text element, which is just going to display the name of this freelancer. So I'm going to grab a text element, and when it comes to the dynamic data here, it's going to be the parent group's product, the creator of that product, so the freelancer, their name. It's super straightforward. And I'm not going to change any of the styling for this text. The only thing I'll need to do is update the responsive settings. So I'm going to head to my layout tab. I'm going to vertically align this in the center of my red group. Now for this text element, I want this to take up as much space as it possibly can inside of my red group. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0 and leave the maximum width to be infinite. So that way it can in fact take up as little or as much space as it needs. For the height, I'm going to set this to be 0, and that's going to wrap nicely around all of the text that sits inside of it there. And then finally, I'm just going to add in 10 pixels of margin to the left, so that way there's some space between our profile photo and this particular text. I can then select on my overall red group here, jump into my layout tab, and now for the height of this group, I can set this to be 0. And because we have this option selected by default, which allows us to fit the height of this element to the content inside of it, it's going to collapse perfectly around our text. And then finally, I'm just going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the left and 10 on the right here. And that just ensures that this group isn't going to touch the borders of my overall white group. Now I know that seemed like a lot just to add in 2 elements, but this is just a great example of how you can use groups as building blocks within your application. And if you take the time to color code these, as I mentioned, it's going to feel like you're building with Lego, so you know exactly where every brick or piece goes on your page. Now finally, there's 2 last elements I'll need to add into this group, and I promise that that is the last thing we'll be doing here. And the 2 elements I'll need to add are both text elements. One will just display the description summary for this product, and the other will display the price. So if we head to our visual elements, I'm going to add a text element into our white group. I'm going to choose to insert dynamic data. And in this case, I'm just going to reference the parent group's product, the description summary. Now, later on in our tutorial, when a freelancer goes to actually publish a product, we're going to allow them to save a full description for each product. But what I'm also going to do at the same time is just create a description summary, which is just going to be the first 50 characters of that main description. So that way it just gives someone on our homepage a bit of an overview of what's included in this product. And so because this is just going to be the first 50 characters, I'm just going to select below this and add in 3 dots just to show that this text actually continues on as well. Now, when I'm working with this text element, I'm not going to update the styling. Instead, I'm just going to jump to my layout tab and of course update the responsive settings. So when I'm working with most text elements, I'm going to follow the main settings I mentioned before, which is that I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width as 0 leave the maximum width as infinite, and I'm also going to update the minimum height to be 0, and because this option is selected, it's going to collapse nicely around all of the text inside of it there. And then finally, I'm going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the left and 10 on the right. And now there is one very last text element I'll need to add in, and that is going to be the price of this particular product you see. So I'm going to actually make a copy of this text element here. And the only thing I'll need to change is within my appearance tab. Instead of displaying the parent group's product description, I'm just going to reference the price. I'm also going to select this more option because I just like to change how we actually format this text element. Because of course I want this to be formatted as a dollar value. So I'm going to choose to format this not as a number, but as a currency. And I'm going to set the currency symbol here to be dollars. Of course, if you're based in a different region, you can choose whatever currency symbol works for your local economy. But for me, I'm just going to select dollars. I can then close this. I'm also going to remove the 3 dots that I've added, and I'm going to remove the style of this text element because I just like to bold this so that way it stands out. And finally, because this is the last element I'd like to add into my white group, I'm just going to add a margin at the bottom of this element. So if I jump to my layout tab, I'll add in 10 pixels of margin at the bottom. And that is the very last thing we'll need to add into our white group. So I'm going to select on the white group itself, and within its layout tab, I can now set the minimum height to be 0. And because we have this option selected to fit the height of this element to the content inside of it, it's going to make sure that it collapses nicely around all of our elements we've just created. And because we've now finished updating all of the settings for our white group here, we can then select on our overall repeating group and finalize the very last settings we'll need to tweak here. And when I'm making changes to our overall repeating group, at this point in time, we have a maximum height set of 350 pixels. And the reason for that is because when we made this repeating group, we just duplicated it from our first repeating group, which did in fact need a maximum height of 350 pixels. But what you'll see is that we have all of this empty space around each of our cards here. So if I just jump into my appearance tab, first of all, I'm going to update the minimum height of each row to be 320 pixels. Now, the reason why I'm selecting 320 pixels is purely just from experimentation of my own. There's no real scientific reason behind it. And what I mean by that is that I previously just experimented around with how much height I need for each of these cards, and it was roughly 320 pixels. And I'll show you how I got to that now by jumping into my layout tab. And if I was to set the maximum height here to also be 320 pixels, and then update the container alignment for our repeating group to be centered, which is obviously going to move our white group into the center of our repeating group here, what you'll see is that 320 pixels in height fits perfectly around this white group. So that's how I came to that. Essentially, I just experimented with this being 350 pixels, and then I just kept going down. So let's say I added 340, and then I eventually just went down to 320 and found that that was a perfect height. So that one was a bit of a trial and error there. And at this point, that is exactly how we can create this repeating group we needed. But the very last thing I want to do on this page is just create one last duplicate version of this repeating group. And the reason for that is because this repeating group here only displays a list of popular gigs within the search engine optimization category. Whereas you also might like to display a series of popular gigs in other categories, so things like social media or data entry. And so I just want to take the time to show you how you can easily just make a duplicate version of this repeating group and swap out the product category that you're displaying. And so in order to do that, I'm just going to first of all select my text element here. I'm going to make a copy of this and I'm going to drag this below our repeating group. And I'm going to jump to my appearance tab here and I'm just going to update the text to display the words popular gigs in data entry. You can see I just have a small typo there, so I'm going to fix that. And then below this, I'm going to make a copy of our repeating group. I'm going to drag this below our text, and I can just see that we need some additional height on our page because this repeating group is being cut off. So I'm going to select on our overall page, which is our gray element, so our index page. I'll jump to our layout tab, and I'm just going to set the minimum height here to be 2000, and that's just going to give everything room to breathe. Now for our repeating group, literally the only change we'll need to make is within the data source. Everything else is perfect. So if I select on the repeating group, jump to my appearance tab, you may remember that for this repeating group, we're searching through a list of products where the category was SEO. So all I'll need to do here is just update the category. So I can now search for all of the products where the category is data entry. and I can choose to close that. And look, if you wanted to display any additional categories on your homepage, you could do exactly what I've just shown you. You could easily just make a copy of the repeating group and update the data source, and it would work perfectly fine. And it's at this point that we've finally finished everything I wanted to cover within this section of this module. And I know straight out of the gate, this was a huge module to work on. Most of my tutorials don't really go into this much depth straight away, but when it comes to building out the homepage for Fiverr, they do use a lot of repeating groups, which just take a lot of time to configure, as you could see. And I truly just wanted to make sure I didn't spare any detail when it came to explaining the concepts that you need in order to build out this page. Now, if you were to go and take a preview of your page after adding those additional repeating groups in, what you'll find is that there won't be any products that display inside of these repeating groups. And that's because we haven't yet built out the feature to create a new product in our database. But as soon as we build that feature out, you'll see all of those products come to life on your homepage. Finally, jumping back into my Notion checklist, we can tick off that we've finished building out the homepage, which not only included the hero section with our search bar, the list of categories that someone could search through, and of course, we're going to build out that search feature later on, but we also built out a way to display a list of featured products within each of the particular categories. This was definitely not a small module, so you should be proud of yourself for getting this far. After building out the main portion of our homepage, the next feature I just wanted to cover in my list was building out a navigation menu. And now this navigation menu is going to allow users to navigate between all of the different pages we create within our app today. And not only is this navigation menu going to be displayed on our homepage, but it's going to be displayed on every other page inside of our app. And thankfully, in comparison to the first section of our tutorial where we built out the homepage, this is a much simpler process. And so what we're going to do is we're going to jump into our bubble editor. And when it comes to building out a navigation menu, what you would traditionally do is add a group element to the very top of your page. So let's say, for instance, I could just move this to be the first element on my page. And then inside of this group, you would just set the container layout to be a row because you'd want to position elements side by side, so horizontally across your page. However, because our navigation menu is going to be displayed on every single page in our application, we don't want to have to rebuild this from scratch every single time we want to use it. And so that's why I just want to introduce you to a feature in Bubble known as reusable elements. So I'm just going to select on this group and delete this for now. And if I was to open up my page drop-down menu, right at the bottom, you'll see almost like this little hidden menu to add what's known as a reusable element. And so a reusable element, as the name would suggest, allows you to build an element once and then reuse it at any point in your application. So instead of having to rebuild it time and time again, you just build it once and you can display it multiple times. It's kind of like how we added a style on our main button on the homepage. So we obviously wanted to create a style that we could reference at any point in time in the future. And so that's what we're doing with this element. And so the first thing you'll need to do is give a name to your reusable element. In this case, I'm just going to call mine the header menu. I'm then going to choose to create this. And then what you'll see is that this reusable element is going to take you through to a separate page. And this is where you can actually build out the element itself. Now, if I was to double click on this element and head over to the Appearance tab, what you'll see is that we're actually not working on a page. Instead, we're working on a group. So for the type of element here, we have a couple of different options. We can select that this should be a group, a pop-up, or a floating group. And in this case today, this is just going to be a standard group. So although this does look like it's its own dedicated page, whatever we build here is going to be added onto our main homepage. And so if I was building out a navigation menu as a group, the first thing I'd like to do is just make this a little wider on my page. So I'm going to jump to my layout tab here. And in order to access all of my width settings, I'm going to need to update the container layout. Now, as I'd previously mentioned, this is going to be a row because I'd like to stack elements in this group horizontally. And what you'll now see is that we have the ability to access all of these settings here. Now, by default, this group actually has a minimum width of 0 and a maximum width of infinite. So that just means it's going to be as small or as large as it possibly can be on our page. So it's already fully responsive. What you will find though is that this setting here, so the width for the UI builder, is currently set to 200 pixels. So although this group is fully responsive, so if I jump into my responsive tab, you'll see it'll expand and contract. The width of how this is displayed within our bubble editor is currently set to 200 pixels. Whereas what I might like to do is just set that to be 960 pixels. And so I just want to point out that this width of 960 pixels isn't going to determine the final width of this actual group. This is just the width of how it's going to be displayed inside of our bubble editor. Now inside of this, what I'd like to do is add in all of my elements. And the very first element I'd like to add is going to be an image element that sits on the left-hand side of this group. And that image is of course going to be a Fiverr logo. And if I was to just open up another tab here and go to my Google Drive folder, what you'll see is that I've already uploaded a Fiverr logo that you can download and then upload into your own bubble application. So I'm just going to jump back into my editor here. I'm going to head to my visual elements and I'm going to add an image element into my group. Now I'm going to set this to be a static image because I'm always going to want this to be the same image. And I'm going to upload that Fiverr logo I just shown you. Now, once I've uploaded this image, you'll see right now that the dimensions are quite skewed. So if I jump over to my layout tab, I can update all of the dimensions. And so what I'm going to do is first of all, update the width of this image to be 100 pixels. And I'm going to keep this as a fixed width. Now I will update this again in a moment, but the reason I just want to keep this as a fixed width for now is because I also want to tick this option to keep this element's aspect ratio fixed. And if I was to update the aspect ratio to be 3:1, this is just going to reformat the image in its proper dimensions. I'm also then going to vertically align this in the center of my group. And finally, I'm going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the bottom, and 30 pixels of margin on the left. And that's just going to ensure when I collapse all of this empty height in my white group, it doesn't touch the borders of this image itself. Then after adding in this element, I'd like to add in the main section of our actual navigation menu. And that's going to be the option where users can select what pages they would like to navigate between. Now, in order to add all of those page options in, I'm actually going to store those within a group. And I'll show you why I'm doing that in a moment. But before I explain that, I'm just going to head on down to my containers menu and add a group element into my overall white group. And the first thing I'll do with this group is not update the container layout, but instead jump over to my appearance tab. And I'm going to choose to remove the style of this group. And I'm going to give it a flat background color. I could make this a light shade of red, just so that way I can easily see where this group sits in my overall reusable element. I'm then going to jump over to my layout tab here, and I'm going to update the container layout to be a row. The reason for that is because, of course, I'm going to be stacking a series of elements side by side here. So that means elements will be placed in this horizontally. For the width, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. So now this group is going to take up as little or as much space as it possibly can inside of my overall reusable element. And then when it comes to the elements inside of this group, I'd like to display the name of some pages that I'm going to allow someone to navigate between. So I'm going to scroll on up to my visual element, and I'm just going to add in a couple of different text elements. So I'm going to add the first one in here, and this is just going to display the word messages. When it comes to this text element, I'm also going to remove the style of this because I'd like to bold this text as well as align this in the center of the element itself. I will then jump to my layout tab because I'll need to update the responsive settings for this text element. And of course, when it comes to this, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width as 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite. However, I would just like to tick this option here to fit the width of this element to the content inside of it. And what that just means is that although this text element can take up as much space as it needs to fit in this word, the actual borders of the element will collapse around that word. I'll do the exact same thing for my height. So if I set the minimum height to be 0, the borders of this element are going to collapse around the height of this text, which is perfect. I'll then align this in the center of my red group, so that way it sits in line with my Fiverr logo. And that's all I'll need to change for this text element. What I'd like to do is add yet another one into my page. So I'm going to make a copy of this. And in this case, I'm going to update the text to display the word orders. And now I won't need to change any of the styling because I've already copied this across from my first element. The only thing I will need to do is just add in some spacing between these two text elements. So if I jump to my layout tab here, I'm just going to add in 20 pixels of margin on the left. And that is all I'll need to change. And then finally, next to this text element, I'd like to add in an image element, which is going to display the profile photo of someone when they're logged in. So in order to do that, I'm going to jump to my visual elements. I'll add in an image element. And when it comes to this image, I'd actually like to insert dynamic data because I'd like to reference the current user. So the current user is the person who is logged in and they're viewing the Fiverr marketplace. I'm going to reference their profile photo data field. Because I'm working with an image, I'm going to select to process this image with Imgix, and I'm going to resize the dimensions by cropping it, which just means that the image is going to scale out and fit nicely into whatever dimensions I set this to be. I'm also then just going to remove the style of this because I'd like to add a solid border around this image, as well as set the roundness of its borders to be 100, so that way it becomes a perfect circle. I can then jump to my layout tab here because I'd also like to update the dimensions of this image. And in this case, the dimensions are going to be 40 pixels in width, and I will be keeping this as a fixed width because at any given point in time, I'm only going to want this to be this size. I don't want it to be any smaller or any larger. I'll also tick this option to keep this element's aspect ratio fixed, and I'll have that be at a 1:1 ratio, so that way it becomes a perfect square. I can then choose to vertically align this in the center of my red group, and finally just add in 20 pixels of margin on the left, so that way this profile photo does not also touch the text element beside it. Now, one thing I should just point out is that if the user has not taken the time to upload their own custom profile photo, which I'm going to be explaining how we can create a settings page in a moment, if you remember in our database under our user data type, we'd already taken the time to upload a default image, which is just a user alias to their profile photo field. So if they haven't uploaded a custom profile photo, that is the image that's going to be displayed. We'll then jump back into our design tab here because that is all of the elements we'll need to add into this red group. What we could now do though is just build out the workflows that make these elements functional. And so essentially when someone clicks on this messages text, what I'd like to do is send them through to a page in our application, which is going to be their inbox. And that's where they can send and receive messages between any freelancers or business owners. And so if I was to select on this messages text here, I'm going to choose this option to start a new workflow. And this is the very first workflow we're going to create within our tutorial today. And thankfully this workflow is super straightforward. All we're going to do is send someone through to a page. So if we head to our navigation events here, we're just going to select the go to page action. And from here we can select a destination page, which at this point in time, the destination page does not yet exist because we haven't created it. So what we're going to do is choose to create a new page from scratch. And we're going to call this page our inbox page. I'll choose to create this. And now we don't need to make any changes to that page at this point in time. All I want to do is just set that the destination page here should be our inbox page. And while we're also working with this particular workflow, I'm going to click on the workflow trigger and I'm just going to update the event color here to be red. And now the reason I'm doing this is purely just a personal preference of mine, but I personally just like to color code workflows that relate to each other in a particular color. And in this case, I'm going to relate all of my navigation events together. So that way, when I open up my workflow tab, I know that any red workflow is a workflow that sends someone through to a page. So it's a navigation event. We'll then jump back into our design tab, select on our orders text, and we're going to choose to start a workflow whenever this is clicked. And in this case, it's going to be the exact same process of what I've just shown you. We're going to head to our navigation events, select the go to page action. And once again, at this point in time, we haven't yet built out a page that's going to display someone's orders. So I'm going to create a new page here, and I'm going to call this the orders page. I'll create that. I can then select that the destination page should be that new orders page. I'll then select on the workflow trigger and update the event color to be red. So that way I know that these two workflows are both navigation events. And then finally, the very last workflow we'll need to create is when someone selects on their profile photo, in which case I'd like to send them through to a settings page, which of course is where they can update any additional information about their account. So I'm going to choose to start a workflow whenever this image is clicked. And within this workflow, once again, we'll be selecting from the navigation event, the go to page action. The destination page does not yet exist. So we're going to create this from scratch and we're going to call this the settings page. We'll create that. We can then set that the destination page will be that settings page. We'll click on the workflow trigger. And then finally, we'll update the event color here to be red. And now you can see that all three of these workflows are in fact related. We can then jump back into our design tab because that is all of the workflows we'll need to build here. And so because we've finished with all of the elements inside of this red group, we can now select on the red group itself and we can update its responsive settings. So at this point, you can see we've got all of this empty space here. So I'm going to jump into my layout tab, and the first thing I'm going to do is update the minimum height of this group. I'm going to set that to 0, and that's going to collapse nicely around all of my elements inside of it. I'm then going to vertically align this in the center, so that way it is once again in line with our Fiverr logo. But what you'll still see is that we have all of this empty space on the width of this group. So what I can also do is tick this option to fit the width of this element to the content inside of it. And now that's going to wrap perfectly around all of the elements inside of this group. Now, one thing you might notice is that at this point in time, these two groups are positioned exactly beside each other. Whereas what I'd actually like to create is an experience where this red group is positioned on the right-hand side of our menu. And so in order to create that, we can actually click on the overall white reusable element. And if you remember, we'd set the container layout to be a row because we obviously wanted to stack elements horizontally. But because we've selected the option for this container layout to be a row, you'll also see these options to update the container alignment. Now, the container alignment just determines how elements are positioned inside of this white group. So the group acts as a container, and it just determines where it's going to position all of those elements. So by default, this is going to be aligned to the left-hand side of our group. If we wanted to center this, it would obviously align everything in the center. What I'm interested in doing though today is this option here known as the space between. When I select this, what you're going to see is that it's going to add an even amount of space between both of these two elements, and it's going to position them on either side of the group. So now it's created the exact experience we want. What I will need to do though is just add some margin around our red group. So I'm going to select on the red group itself. And for this group, I'm just going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the bottom, 20 on the left, but 30 on the right. And what you'll now see in our responsive tab is that as we reduce the width of this red group will collapse in with our Fiverr logo. So that way it's going to continually be responsive regardless of the page size. Now, if I just jump back into my UI builder, one thing I should point out is that within this group here, we're currently displaying a user's profile photo, as well as all of the pages that they can navigate between. And so because we're displaying this information about a user, that almost just assumes that they're going to be logged into an account, whereas that's actually not the case. There's going to be people who visit our Fiverr clone and at that point in time have not yet created an account. And so instead of displaying all of these options here, what I'd like to do is either show them the option to either create a new account or log into their existing account, from which once they do that, I'm then going to show them this particular group where they can navigate between all of their account pages. And so in order to create this experience, the first thing I'm going to do is add in yet another group into my main group here. So I'm going to add a group into my reusable element. And before I even give this a background color, I'm just going to update the name of this, and I'm going to call this group logged out, because this is the group I'm going to display when someone is logged out of their account. I'm also then going to select on my red group here, and I'm going to update the name of this to be called group logged in, because of course this is the group that's going to display when someone is logged into their account. I'll now jump back to our new group that we've created. I'll jump to our appearance tab, and I'm just going to remove the default style of this because I just like to give this a flat background color. And I could make this, let's say, a light shade of green here, just so that way I can differentiate between the two groups. I'll then jump to my layout tab once again, and I'll need to update the container layout here to be a row, because I'll still be stacking elements in this horizontally, so side by side. I'm also going to update the width settings of this group. Now it's going to follow the same process as our red group we've previously created. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width to 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite, so that way this group can take up as little or as much space as it needs within my header menu. And before we update the height settings for this group, I'm just going to add my elements inside of this. So within this group, I'm going to add two elements. There's going to be a text element and a button. The first thing I'm going to add is that text element. And in order to streamline that process, I'm actually going to select on my messages text here. I'm going to make a copy of that. Then I'm going to select in my green group and paste in a version of that. I'll jump to my appearance tab, and I'll update the text here to display the words sign in. And now because we've copied this text element, we don't need to make any changes to the styling of it. This is all we'll need to do. I would just like to add the button element in beside this though. So under my visual elements, I'm going to grab a button, and this button's just going to display the word join. Now I'd also just like to update the dimensions of this button. So if I jump to my layout tab here, what I'll do is update the width of this button to be 100 pixels. Now I am going to keep that to be a fixed width because at any point in time, I only want this button to be 100 pixels in width. So it'll be no wider or smaller than this size here. I'd also like to update my minimum height to be 40 pixels. So that way it's not as tall. And then while we're here, I'd also just like to add in a left margin of 20. So that way, when I center this button, it doesn't touch the text element that sits beside it. I'll then obviously need to center this, so that way it sits in line with all of our additional elements. And thankfully, that is all we'll need to add into this green group here. So I'm going to select on this group. I can then jump to my layout tab. And the first thing I'll do is update the minimum height to be 0, which just means that it's going to collapse around all of the elements inside of it. I'd then like to obviously collapse the width of this element. So if I tick this option to fit the width of this element to the content inside of it, it will collapse nicely around our group. I can then choose to vertically align this group in the center of our overall reusable element. And then finally, I'm just going to add in some margins around this group. I'm going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the bottom, 20 on the left, and 30 on the right here. And now look, at this point in time, you're probably looking at our overall reusable element and you're wondering why we have 3 different sections. In reality, I'd like this group here to be positioned on the right-hand side as well. And look, this is an experience we can easily create. So if you think about it, only one of these groups should be displayed at any point in time. So if a user is not logged in, I'd like to display this green group. Whereas if a user is logged in, I'd like to display our red group. And so in order to create that experience, what we can do is head to our layout tab for our first group, and we can actually unselect this option that makes this element visible on page load, which just means that it's no longer going to be visible by default. I can also tick this option to collapse this element when it's hidden, which just means that it's not going to take up any empty space when it's not being displayed. But what I will need to do is create a condition that just recognizes when that group should actually be shown. And in that case, it's going to be when the user is logged out, because of course this group prompts someone to log in or register an account. And so if I jump to my conditional tab for this group, I'm going to choose to define a condition. Now, if you're new to Bubble, conditions are kind of like a way of just determining if a particular behavior is true. We're going to create a specific use case that's going to occur. And so in this case, I'm just going to recognize when the current user is in fact logged out. What I'd like to do is tick that this element should be visible and select that that should be true. And if I wanted to preview what this condition would look like, what I could do is choose to toggle this on and off. And if you ever find that you do want to reference this particular group, you can always jump over to your elements tree here and tick this little eye icon, from which it's then going to display this group for you. Now at this point, we're going to need to do the exact same thing for our red group. So if I select on this red group here, I'm going to head to my layout tab. And of course, I only want this group to be displayed whenever a user is in fact logged in. So what I'm going to do is unselect that this element should be visible by default. I will select the option to collapse this element when it's hidden. And what you'll now see is that because this element is no longer visible on our page, this green group is going to move over and take its place. So this is kind of how it's going to function in the real world application. What I will need to do though is jump over into my conditional tab and just create a condition that's going to recognize when this group should be displayed. So I'm going to define a condition and I'm just going to recognize when the current user is in fact logged in. I will select that this element should be visible and tick that that is true. And of course, I can toggle this on and off to see what that looks like whenever this condition is in fact true. And now that is everything we'll need to build out when it comes to these two groups. In a separate module later on, I'm going to explain how we can create a process to actually register a new account and also log a user into their existing account. But for the time being, I don't want to overcomplicate things in this menu. Because we've finished adding in all of these elements though, what I'm going to do is select on the overall reusable element itself. So this is our header menu. Now, of course, because this is a group that all of our additional elements sit within, I'm going to need to jump to my layout tab. And like any group, I'm going to need to set the minimum height to be 0, which just means it's going to collapse around all of the elements that sit within it. And that is how we can create our header menu. And I'll show you a preview of this in a moment. But before I do that, there is one last thing I'd just like to show you, and that is how we can make this element fully responsive. So if I was to jump into my responsive tab here, And let's say I was to open up the group which is displayed when a user is logged in, because this is the longest of the two groups I have. If I was to preview this on a desktop, obviously this looks great because this group will always continually be positioned on the right-hand side of our header menu. However, if I was to view this on a mobile device that's 320 pixels in width, what you'll see is that these two elements stack on top of each other because there's not enough room for these to fit in side by side. Now, in my opinion, it's not the worst experience in the world, but if you truly wanted to create a fully responsive experience where both of these elements would still be sitting side by side, what we could do is choose to update the values set for our image here. So if I click on our image element, you may remember that I'd mentioned that this has a fixed width of 100 pixels. So at any point in time, this image will be 100 pixels, no less and no larger. To make this image fully responsive, what we could actually do is unselect that this should be a fixed width. And if I was to, let's say, set the maximum width to 100 pixels, I could also set the minimum width to be something like 40 pixels. And that just means that at its largest possible size, this image will be 100 pixels, which is the exact size we had before. However, it now has the ability to shrink down to 40 pixels. So as I expand this page out, this image is going to grow. And as I shrink this down, this is going to continually shrink until it gets to 40 pixels. Now, if I was to preview this on a mobile device at the smallest possible size, so 320 pixels, you'll now see that all of these elements fit in line perfectly. And so that is how you can create a fully responsive navigation menu. It's a fairly straightforward process. What I'd love to do from here though is just show you how we can actually add this navigation menu into our homepage. So if we open up our page drop-down menu, we can head to our index page. And if we scroll right on down to the bottom of our elements tree here, and if I just move my head out of the way, what you'll see is a menu that displays all of our reusable elements. So our header menu is already here. And if I was to add this onto my page and then make this the very first element on my page, you will now see that our menu is being displayed at the top of our page. So that way we didn't have to rebuild it on this page. We could simply just reference all of the work that we've created so far. Now, one thing I should note is that with a reusable element, once you've added it onto a page, as you'll see, you can't actually make changes to this element on the page itself. If you ever want to make changes, you need to head back into the reusable element itself, and this is where you can update any of those changes. And of course, anything you update here will automatically be reflected in real time on your actual page, wherever you display this element. What I'd love to do now though is just show you a quick preview of how this is going to look on our homepage. So if I choose to run a preview of our application, what you'll see at the top of our page is that we now have this reusable element. And of course, because I'm currently not logged into an account, we're being displayed the green group, which just displays my text to either sign in or join by creating a new Fiverr account. And look, that is everything I wanted to cover within this section of our tutorial today. So what we're going to do is jump back over into our Notion checklist, and we're just going to tick off that we've finished building out the navigation menu as a reusable element. And you'll see as we build out more pages throughout our application, I'm going to add this same reusable element onto every single page. So that way an end user can easily just jump between all of the different pages we create today. Moving our way through the list of features I have set out for us in our Notion checklist today, I actually just wanted to jump ahead for the sake of our tutorial to the feature where we're going to create our first product listing. So within this feature, we're going to allow those users who are freelancers to actually list their products or services on our Fiverr marketplace. Now, throughout this process, there is quite a bit involved. However, of course, it is my job to make things as easy as possible for you. So let's just start by jumping over into our bubble editor. And the first thing we're going to do is open up our page drop-down menu, and we're going to create a brand new page from scratch. So we're going to head on down and add a new page here. And when it comes to this page, I'll be calling this our listing page because this is where we're going to create and eventually edit product listings. I'll choose to create this here. Then once our page has been created, there's a few quick things I'll need to update before we can start adding all of the elements onto the page itself. And the first thing is, of course, updating the background color. So that way we can actually see where it sits in our overall bubble canvas. So if I double click on our page and open up our property editor, I'm just going to update the background color to be this light shade of gray, which if you'd like that color code, it's F7, F7, F7. I'm then going to need to jump into our layout tab because of course I'll need to update the container layout for this page. And of course, when we're working with pages, we're always going to want to stack these from top to bottom, which means we're going to need to set the container layout here to be a column. Now, when it comes to the overall elements I'm going to add onto this page, the very first thing I'd like to do at the top is just add in our navigation menu. So that's our reusable element that we previously created. And of course, because it is a reusable element, it's super simple to add that onto our page. So if I was to just move my head out of the way here and scroll on down my elements tree, I'm going to grab my header menu from within my reusable element, and I'm just going to add this at the top of my page. And of course, that is all I'll need to do. I don't need to do anything else. It's already been configured and set up. So I'm just going to move my head back to the other side of the screen again. And now below this is where we can actually start to build out the experience where a freelancer can upload and publish their very first product to our platform. Now, whenever a freelancer does upload a product, they're going to need to add in some information about that. So things like the title of the product, the overview of the product, the price, as well as upload a series of images that can be used to be displayed on that product page. Now, similar to the real-world Fiverr experience, I want to break this down into different sections. So I essentially want to have two different groups on this page, and each of those groups will ask the user to input some different information. And so in the first group, I just want to ask the user to add in a title, a price, a category, and a featured image for this product. So that's all of the overarching information for the service that they would like to offer. And so to get started with this, we're going to head up to our containers menu and we're going to add a group element onto our page. And before I make any changes to this group, I'm just going to update the name of this and call this group Stage 1. Because within our overall process of uploading a product, this is going to be step 1 in that sequence. Now, when it comes to this group, I'll also jump to my appearance tab because I'm going to want to remove the style of this. And I'm going to want to set the background style to be a flat color, and I'll be leaving that as white. And then from here, I'm going to update the roundness of its borders to be 10, so that way it has some curved edges. I can then jump over into my layout tab here because I'll need to update the container layout for this group. Now, inside of this group, I'll be stacking elements vertically, so from top to bottom, which of course means that I'll need to set the container layout here to be a column. Now, when it comes to making this group fully responsive, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I am going to set the minimum width as 0, but what you'll see here is that because our maximum width is infinite, this group's going to take up the entire width of our page. And that's not the experience I want to create. Instead, what I'd like to do is set the maximum width to be something like 800 pixels. And so that just ensures that at the largest possible size, this group will never be wider than 800 pixels, which is what you see here. But of course, because we have a minimum width of 0, it will be fully responsive. So it will shrink all the way down to 0 pixels if needed. Now, I'm also going to horizontally align this group in the center of my page, just so that way it's not veering over to one particular side. And now inside of this group, we can start adding in all of our elements. And so the very first thing I'd like to do is just add a heading inside of this group. So I'm going to scroll on up to our visual elements. I'm going to grab a text element and add this in. And I'm going to have this display the words gig overview. And when it comes to this particular text element, I'm going to remove the style of this because I'd like to update the font size here to be 16. I'm also going to choose to bold this font. I'll then need to make this element fully responsive. So I'm going to jump to our layout tab. I will, like every text element, unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width as 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite. So now this text element will take up as little or as much space as it possibly can inside of our overall white group. For the height, I'm also going to set the minimum height to be 0. And because this option is selected by default to fit the height of the element to the content inside of it, it's going to wrap nicely around all of the text inside of it there. Then finally, I'd just like to add some margins around this text element so that way it doesn't touch the borders of my white group. So I'm going to set the top margin to be 20, the left margin to be 20, and the right margin to also be 20. Now below our heading, what I'd like to do is add in a series of input fields, which will just allow our freelancer to add in all of the information for the product that they would like to offer. Before I add in those input fields though, I'm just going to add in a heading element above each of those fields, just so the freelancer knows what information they need to put into each individual field. And look, in order to streamline the process of adding that heading in, I'm just going to make a copy of our existing text element here. If I just jump to my appearance tab though, I'm just going to update this text to display the words gig title. And when it comes to the font size, I'm just going to set this to be 14. So that way it's not as prominent as the existing heading we've just added. And now that we've finished adding in this little subheading here, we can add our very first input field. So if we're scrolling down to our input forms, if we're storing the title of a product, this is just going to be a fairly straightforward process. All we're going to need is a regular input field. So I'm going to add this into our group. And the first thing I'm going to do is update the title of this. And I'm going to call this input gig title. So that way when I create a workflow in a moment, I know exactly which input field to reference. Now this input field here is fine as text, but what I will need to do is just jump over to my layout tab here and make this fully responsive. So like always, as you probably guessed, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width to 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. And now that just means that this input field will take up as little or as much space as it can in our overall white group. When it comes to the margins, I'm also just going to add in 20 pixels on the left and 20 on the right. And look, I'm not too concerned about updating the height. I'm quite happy with that being 48 pixels as a fixed value. So that just means that the height of this element will always be this size that you see here. Now below this input field, I'd like to add a drop-down menu, which is just going to allow a freelancer to determine what category this freelancing product should belong to. And now before I add in that input field, I'm just going to make a copy of my text element here. I'll drag this down and I'll update this to display the word category. And then from here, I can add in that drop-down menu. So if I head to my input forms, I'm going to add a drop-down menu in here. And I'm going to update the name of this to be called drop-down gig category. And now when it comes to the options that are going to be displayed for a freelancer to select from, if you remember in our database, we had already taken the time to create a list of option sets, which was known as categories. And of course, inside of this, we had all of the categories we added at the beginning of our tutorial. Essentially, what I just like to do is display all of these options here. So that way a freelancer can select from the most relevant category that belongs to this product that they're creating. So if we jump in our design tab, thankfully this is a fairly straightforward process. All we need to do is update the choices style here. So that is the list of choices that are going to be displayed within this drop-down menu. And for this option, because the list of choices already exists in our database as a list of option sets, we'll just need to update the choices style to be a list of dynamic choices. Then for the type of choices, I'm going to reference the categories option set we've already created. Then for the choices source, so this determines which category should be displayed. This is fairly straightforward. I just like to display all of my categories. And then finally for the option caption, so that's the actual text that displays within our drop-down menu. I just like to display the current option, its display text. So that is the actual name of the option set itself. Once again, it is fairly straightforward. What we will need to do now though is jump into our layout tab because we'll need to make this element fully responsive as well. So when it comes to this drop down menu, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. Like always, I'll set the minimum width as 0. But when it comes to the maximum width, for drop down menus, I personally don't like them being as long as a regular input field. Because when you think about it, the options themselves within the drop down menu will really just be positioned on the left hand side here. They don't need all of this space. So what I'm going to do is just set a maximum width here of 300 pixels, which just means that at any point in time, this is the largest possible size that our drop-down menu could be. And that to me looks a little bit more reasonable. When it comes to the height, I'm just going to once again leave this as a fixed value at 48 pixels. I won't need to make changes there. The only other thing I'll need to do is just add in some margins around this drop down. So I'm going to add in 20 pixels of margin on the left and 20 pixels of margin on the right. And now below this, we can add in yet another input field. And that input field is just going to allow the freelancer to add in the price they would like to list this product for. So once again, before I add in that input field, I'm going to make a copy of this text element. I'll drag this down below our existing drop-down menu. I can then jump to our appearance tab and update this to display the word price. Now, when it comes to the input field we're going to display below this heading, it's just going to be a regular input field. So in order to streamline that process, I'm just going to actually make a copy of this existing input field we have here. And of course, I'd like to move this below that text element. So if I just jump to my layout tab, I can select to make this the last element inside of my group, and that will position down accordingly. Now, while I'm working with this input field, the first thing I'd like to do is update the title of this. So if I head to the property editor, I'm going to change the title here to be called input gig price. So that way, when I build out my workflow in a moment, I know which input field to reference. I'm also going to jump to my appearance tab here and just update the content format of this input field. So right now, this input field is just storing a text value. Whereas if I open up this drop down menu, I'd actually like this to store a currency. So that way someone can type in a dollar amount that they would like to charge for this product. Now, I'm also just going to leave my currency prefix as dollars, but feel free to select whichever option is relevant to your region. Now, when it comes to the responsive settings of this input field, while at this point in time, this input field is in fact fully responsive, what I would like to do is just jump into my layout tab and set a maximum width on this input field to be 300 pixels. And the reason for that is because when it comes to the price, you don't really need much space. In most cases, you're just going to be adding in up to 3 digits max. So you really don't need a lot of room to work with. And if I set the maximum width to be 300 pixels, it's going to sit perfectly in line with our drop-down menu above it there. Now we're almost at the end of our first group here. There is one last input field I'd like to add, and that's just going to be a picture uploader that allows the freelancer to upload the featured image, or I guess you could also call it the thumbnail image for this particular product. So what I'm going to do is make a copy of my text element once again. I'll move this to the last position within my group, and I'm going to head to my appearance tab and update this text to display the words featured image. And then below this, I'd like to add in a picture upload element. So if we jump to our input forms, I'm going to add in a picture uploader. I'll add this into our group, jump to my layout tab and move this to the last position in my group. Then from here, I'll update the name of this. I'm going to call this picture uploader featured image. And when it comes to the dimensions of this picture uploader, what I'd like to do is actually unselect that this should be a fixed width. I am going to set the minimum width as 0, so that way this element can reduce to the smallest possible size. However, I'm not going to leave the maximum width as infinite because I don't want it to stretch all the way out across my white group. What I'm actually going to do is set the maximum width to be 300 pixels, so that way it sits perfectly in line with all of our additional input fields above it. Now, I will also leave the height here fixed at 150 pixels. So at this point in time, this picture uploader is going to be at a 2:1 ratio. So that just means that although the height is 150 pixels, the width is twice the size. And that's just going to create this rectangle shape, which is the same aspect ratio that I'd like people to upload images as. The final thing we'll need to do with this element is just add in 20 pixels of margin on the left and 20 pixels of margin on the right. And then within our overall group, we just need to add a button element below this, and then that will complete this group. So if we scroll on up to our visual elements, I'm going to add a button element inside of this group. And when it comes to this button, I'm just going to have this display the word continue. I'll then jump over to my layout tab. And for this button, I'm actually going to keep the dimensions as they are. I'm not going to make any changes here. The only thing I'd like to do is just add in some margin around each individual border for this button. So I'm going to add in 20 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the bottom, 20 on the left, and 20 on the right. And that'll just ensure that the bottom of our group doesn't touch the very last element inside of it there. And that actually wraps up all of the elements I'd like to add within our first group here. So what I'm going to do is select on the overall group itself, jump to my layout tab, and it's at this point in time that I can now set the minimum height to be 0. And because we have this default option selected to fit the height of this element to the content inside of it, it's just going to collapse nicely around all of the elements as it already had. Then finally, I'm just going to add in some margins around this group. So I'm going to set the top margin to be 30 pixels, the left margin to be 20, and the right margin to also be 20. And that is the very last thing we'll need to change for this group here. Now, what I would like to do is add yet another group onto our page, which is going to allow the freelancer to store some additional information for this product. So that's going to be things like the full description, as well as allow them to upload a series of images that will be displayed on the product page. Now, before I add that group in, I'm just going to need to expand the height of my page here. So I'm going to select on my overall gray page, jump to my layout tab, and I'm just going to set the minimum height here to be something like 2000 pixels. Now, of course, I can come back and update that later on before I preview or publish my app, but I just want a fair bit of space to work within for the time being. And now from here, when it comes to the second group I'd like to add in, instead of having to build that group from scratch, I'm actually just going to select on our first group here, and I'm going to make a copy of that. I'm then going to head down to the copied version, and the very first thing I'll do is head over to the title of this group and update the name of this to be called Group Stage 2. So that way I can now differentiate between these two groups here. Now, thankfully, inside of this group, we don't need to add too many input fields, but what I will need to do is first of all, just update the title that's displayed inside of this group. So instead of displaying the words gig overview, what I'd like to do is update this to display the words gig details. And within this group, as I mentioned, there's two particular fields I'd like to store. One is going to be the description for this product, and the other is going to be a picture uploader that allows someone to upload multiple images. And so what I'm going to do is select on our very first text element that sits above an input field, and I'm going to update this to display the words gig description. And instead of having just a single line input field below this, what I'd like to do is actually add in a multi-line input field. Because when it comes to the description of the gig, I want the freelancer to add in as many details as possible. So that way they can give a proper overview of the service or product that they are in fact offering. So if I scroll on down to my input forms, I'm going to grab a multi-line input field and add this below my heading here. Now, before I make any changes to this input field, I'm going to update the title of this. I'm going to call this multi-line input gig description. And then from here, I can jump over into my layout tab because I'll need to make this element fully responsive. So if I head to my width settings, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width as 0. And for this input field, I am going to keep the maximum width as infinite. And the reason for that is because I do want this input field to expand across the full width of our overall white group here. Now, when it comes to the height, I'm also going to leave the minimum width as 100 pixels. And from there, I will also leave the maximum width as infinite. So that just means that this input field is going to continually expand based on how much text is added into it. The only thing I will just need to do is add in 20 pixels of margin on the left and 20 pixels of margin on the right. And that's just going to ensure that this input field doesn't touch the borders of my group. Now from here, what I'm going to do is select on the input field below this, as well as the drop down and the price input field and titles. And I'm going to actually delete these from this group. And the reason for that is because I only need one additional input field. And the purpose of that input field is going to allow a user to upload multiple images, which will then be displayed on this product page within our marketplace. And so before we make any changes to the input field, I'm going to select on the title element above it here. And I'm going to head to my appearance tab and update this to display the word images. That's all I'll need to change here. What I do need to point out though is that when it comes to the standard picture uploader element within Bubble, unfortunately this element only allows you to upload one image at a time. So if a freelancer wanted to add multiple images to showcase their product, so let's say they have 5 images they'd like to display, this input element would not be able to support that. So what we actually need to do is use a custom uploader instead. And this custom uploader is a free plugin within our plugin library. So we're going to need to first of all delete this standard picture uploader here. We're going to then jump to our plugins tab. We're going to add a new plugin and we're going to type in the word multi here. Now below our multi-select drop-down menu, you'll see this option known as the multi-file uploader. So as the name would suggest, this allows someone to upload multiple files at once, so multiple images. What we're going to do is choose to install this here. I'll then close my plugin library, jump back to my design tab, and what you'll see under your input forms is that you now have access to this multi-file uploader. So if I add this below my text element here, what you'll see is that this file uploader is quite small. So we're going to need to update the layout settings for this. Before I do that though, what I'm going to do is update the title of this. And I'm going to call this multi-file uploader gig images. And while we're working within our appearance tab here, I'm just going to scroll on down and update the roundness of this element's borders to be 10. So that way it has some curved edges. I'd also like to add a solid border around this. So that way our end users can see where they actually need to upload files into. Now from here, I'll jump into my layout tab because of course I'll need to update the dimensions of this file uploader. And when it comes to the dimensions of this file uploader, it's going to be the exact same as our standard picture uploader. So what I'm going to do is unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width to be 0. And then I'm going to update the maximum width to be 300 pixels, which as you'd probably guess then means that I'm going to set the height here to be 150 pixels. And I am going to keep that as a fixed value. So it will always be this height, which just creates this nice aspect ratio for us. Finally, I'm then going to add in 20 pixels of margin on the left and 20 pixels of margin on the right. But we're not quite done here yet. So unlike a picture uploader, which when you upload an image, it displays a preview of that image, our multi-file uploader does not do that. Instead, what the multi-file uploader does is just displays a list of all of the file names that you've uploaded into this field. So what we actually need to do is create our own custom way of displaying all of the images that have been uploaded into this element. And the way we can do that is by adding a repeating group below this element that displays a list of images. And we can choose to hide that repeating group and only display it when there are in fact images within this file uploader. And so in order to do that, what I'm going to do is first of all add a group element below this, and then I'll add a repeating group inside of that group. And the reason I'm adding the repeating group inside of a group is because group elements offer you some additional settings when it comes to actually hiding and displaying them. And I'll show you that in a moment. But what we're going to do is just head to our containers menu here, and I'm going to choose to add a group element below my multi-file uploader. Now for the name of this group, I'm going to call this something like group image preview. I'm then going to jump to my appearance tab here, and I'm going to remove the style of this, give it a flat background color, and I'm going to set that to be, let's say, a light shade of red. Now, while I'm working on this group, this is just going to allow me to determine where it actually sits on my page. I'll then jump to my layout tab because of course I'll need to update the responsive settings of this. Before I do that though, of course, I'll need to set a container layout for this group. Now, because I'm only adding one element into this group, it doesn't really matter if you select between a row or a column. I'm personally more of a column guy, so I'm going to select that. What I will need to do though is update the responsive settings of this group. Now, I'm going to want this group to span across the full width of the white group that it sits within. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0, and I am going to leave the maximum width to be infinite. So that way it can take up as much space as it needs. Now, before we update the height and the margins, what I'd like to do is actually add my repeating group into this group. So if I scroll on up to my containers menu, I'm going to once again add in an element, only this time it's going to be a repeating group here. Now, like any repeating group, the first thing you'll need to do is update the data source for this. So this repeating group needs to know what list of things it's actually going to display. Now, this one's a little different. We're not going to be pulling data from our database. Instead, we're going to be referencing the files uploaded within this multi-file drop zone. So when it comes to the type of content I'd like to display within this repeating group, I'm not going to reference a data type or option set within my database. Instead, I'm just going to scroll on down and reference that I'd like to display a list of images. It's very straightforward. Then when it comes to the data source, I'd like to display all of the images uploaded inside of this multi-drop zone. Then when it comes to the data source, I'd like to display all of the files uploaded into this multi-file drop zone. So for the data source here, I'm just going to type in the word multi, and I'm going to reference the multi-file uploader gig images, its value. So that is all of our images within that field. Now, when it comes to this repeating group, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed number of rows, as well as unselect that this should be a fixed number of columns. So this is going to create a grid-like pattern. I'll then jump over to our layout tab here, because I'd like to make this element fully responsive inside of our red group. Before I do that though, I'm just going to need to update the container layout for our repeating group cells. And for this container layout, I'm going to set this to be a row. I'm then going to come down and unselect that this element should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. So that just means, of course, this is going to take up as little or as much space as it can inside of the red group that it sits within. I'll also come back and update the height of this element in a moment. But before I do that, what I'll need to do is add in the actual image element I want to display inside of each repeating group cell. So what I'm going to do is scroll on up to my visual elements, and I'm going to add an image element into our repeating group cell here. Now, when it comes to the data source of this image, I'm going to insert dynamic data, and I'm going to reference the current cell's image. It truly is as simple as that. Just a personal preference of mine though is that I like to select this more option, and when I'm working with images, I like to process these with Imgix, and tick this option to resize the dimensions by cropping them. So that just means that it's going to stretch the image out and make sure it looks nice inside of the frame I'm creating here. I'll then just choose to close this. Now, while we're working with images, I also like to remove the style of these, just so that way I can add a solid border around them, so I can see where the actual image sits on my page. I'll then update the roundness of its borders to be 10, so that way it has some curved edges. And then if I jump over to my layout tab, I'll need to update the responsive settings for each image, because as you can see right now, it's overlapping between each cell of our repeating group. So what I'm going to do is unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0 here, leave the maximum width to be infinite. So now this image is going to take up as little or as much space as it can inside of our repeating group cell. So right now it's taking up the entire space of each cell. I'm then going to select this option to keep this element's aspect ratio fixed. And I'm going to set this to be a 2:1 ratio. So that way this image will now become a rectangle. Then finally, I'm also going to vertically align this image in the center of our repeating group before I then add in 10 pixels of margin around each border of this image. So that way there's some space between all of my image previews. Now at this point in time, we have an image preview here, but it doesn't really look that great. As you can see, we have so many different images that are going to display, and these previews aren't very large. So what can we do to fix that? Look, when it comes to creating repeating groups, I find that the process of finding the perfect settings is often just found through experimentation. However, of course, I've already thought through this, and I'm going to hold your hand and run you through the settings that I would recommend for this repeating group. But in order to do that, it is going to be a bit of a process, so I'm going to walk you through my thinking. So if we were to select on our overall repeating group here and jump to our appearance tab, what you'll see is the ability to update the minimum height and width of each row. So we could start by experimenting by saying we want the minimum height to be 200 pixels and the minimum width to also be 200 pixels. And what you'll see is that we now have a much larger image, which is more in line to the experience we wanted to create today. So let's just leave this as that for now. What we'll then need to do is jump to our layout tab. And what I can see at the bottom of our repeating group is that we have all this empty space here. So that means I'm going to need to update the minimum height of our repeating group. So if I set this to 0, it's going to collapse that. And because we have this option selected to fit the height of this element to the content within it, it's going to collapse nicely around each of our cells. But what you might also notice is that below our repeating group here, we still have all of this empty space at the bottom of our red group. So if we were to select on this red group, jump to our layout tab, we're also going to set the minimum height to be 0. Now at this point, this red group is also touching the borders of our white group and the elements that sit above it. So what I'm going to do is add in 20 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the left, and 20 on the right here. And now that's just going to align this group with all of the additional elements already inside of our main group here. Now, although things are starting to look better, what I can see within our repeating group is that we still have all of this empty space around each image. So to solve that, what I can do is select on my repeating group, jump to my appearance tab. And when it comes to the minimum height of each row, I can actually now set this to be 0. And what that's going to do is collapse this perfectly around the image inside of it. So now you can start to see things are coming together quite nicely. However, there's one last change I want to make, and that is selecting the perfect size for this image here. So if you remember, this image's layout settings have the minimum width set to 0 and the maximum width set to infinite. So that just means that this image is going to be as wide as whatever dimensions we add into the width of our repeating group column. And right now it's set as 200 pixels. But if you remember, in our responsive menu on the smallest possible mobile device, which is 320 pixels, this is what our page is going to look like. So now knowing that the smallest possible configuration of a mobile device is 320 pixels, what we can do is actually calculate how much width we can add for this particular repeating group cell. And so let's say right now it's 200 pixels. What we can do is calculate that if the repeating group cell here, so that entails both the image and its margin. Let's say this whole block here is going to be 200 pixels at the smallest possible size. And then on each end of our red group that our repeating group sits within, it has 20 pixels of margin. So let's say that's 200 plus 20 plus 20. That leaves us at 240. And then we also need to remember that our white group here also has 20 pixels of margin on each side. So if we get 240 and add another 20 plus 20, that gives us 280. So if we were measuring off 320 pixels of minimum width and we currently have 280, we have an extra 40 pixels to work with. So if I select on my repeating group cell, I can now update the minimum width to be 240 pixels. And look, if I was to jump into my responsive tab here, this element is still fully responsive. But if I was to, let's say, make this 250 pixels, what you'll see is that our image now doesn't fit to these responsive settings. So that is how you can calculate and create the perfect responsive experience. It's kind of just like some basic math. But thankfully, that is all we'll need to configure when it comes to the settings of a repeating group. Now, if you are relatively new to Bubble, please don't be overwhelmed with how long it takes to get the settings right for a repeating group. Honestly, at this point in time, I still find that I need to tinker around quite a bit in order to get the perfect dimensions. It almost never comes around on the first time. What we will need to do now though is just jump back to our UI builder, because as I mentioned, we're going to need to create a way to actually hide this red group and only display this whenever a user actually has uploaded some images that they want to preview. So if I just double click on my repeating group, what I want to do is select on the red group that this sits within. So in order to do that, I'm going to right click on my repeating group and select its first parent. Now, because the repeating group sits within our red group, the red group's kind of taking care of the repeating group. So that's why it's known as the parent. If I was to jump into my layout tab, what I'm going to do though is actually unselect this option to make this element visible on page load. So that just means that by default, it's going to be invisible. I'm also going to select this option to collapse this element when it's hidden, which just means that when it's not visible, it's not going to take up any white space on our page. But from here, what we're going to need to do is create a way to actually now display this group. So if we jump to our conditional tab, I'm going to define a condition, and I'm just going to recognize that whenever a user has uploaded some images into this input field, I'd like that red group to be displayed. So I'm just going to recognize when the multi-file uploader, when its value, so its value is of course the files that have been uploaded into it, when the count of how many files are in this field is greater than 0, meaning there is at least one image that has been uploaded, what I'd like to do is select that this element should be visible and tick that that should be true. Then what I'll also do is just jump back into my layout tab. And if you remember how I mentioned that groups have some additional customization when it comes to hiding and displaying them, this is what I was referring to. Below our collapse when hidden checkbox, we also have this additional option to animate the collapse operation. And I'm just going to set this to be the slide up / down option. And when I run a preview of this in a moment, you'll see what this looks like. But if you ever want to view that red group again, all you'll need to do is jump over to your elements tree, open up group stage 2, and you can see that that group is hidden here. So if we select this, it will then be displayed. Now that is everything we'll need to add into these two groups. But just when you thought we were almost there, I have another spanner we're going to throw in the works. So if a user was to come to this page, right now they would see these two groups both being displayed at the same time. Whereas if we wanted to replicate the real-world Fiverr experience, only one of these groups should be displayed at a time. So when a user comes to this page, they should in theory only see this first group here. Then when they click the continue button, this group should hide and our second group should be displayed. And so today what I want to do is take the time to explain how we can actually create that experience. And in order to do that, we're actually going to take advantage of a feature in Bubble known as custom states. Now, if you're relatively new to Bubble and you don't know what custom states are, essentially, they're just a way to temporarily store data in your page without having to reference anything in your database. And today what we're going to do is create a custom state that just recognizes which one of these two groups should in fact be displayed. And thankfully it is a relatively straightforward process to create that. So in order to create a custom state, what we're going to do is double click on our overall page. Now it's at this point I'm going to show you a little hidden backdoor menu inside of Bubble. If you have your property editor open, you can click on this little information icon, and this is where you'll see the wardrobe of Narnia open to you, because this is where we can now create a custom state. So this is where we're going to temporarily store data on our overall page. So this is our listing page. If I select to add a new custom state, what you'll see is that this looks like the same process of creating a data field in your database. And that's because we essentially are. Only this time, we're just creating a data field that we're going to temporarily store on our page. So any information you store on your page isn't going to be saved into your database. If you ever wanted to save that information, you'd need to build workflows to transfer the information from your page into your database. But thankfully, we don't need to do that today. It's going to be much simpler. What I want to do is create a state known as display stage 1. And I'm going to set this state type to be a yes/no value. because we're essentially going to want to display stage 1 or we're not going to display it. And of course, stage 1 is the very first group we've created on our page. I can choose to create that. And what you'll now see within this state is also the option to customize the default value. So if this is a yes/no field, I can set the default value to be yes, which means that as soon as the page is loaded, I would in fact like to display stage 1 of our process. Now, because we've created a custom state that references the display stage 1, we're going to need to create another one which will reference when we should display stage 2 here. So I'm going to create another custom state, and I'm going to call this display stage 2. I'll set the state type to be yes/no. I'll create this. Only this time, I'm going to set the default value of this to be no, because I don't want this group to be displayed until we build out a workflow that tells it that it should now be shown to users. And so that's how we can temporarily store these values in our page. But how can we make these groups react to whatever values are stored in each custom state? What we can do is choose to close this menu and select on our first group here. Now, if we head to our layout tab, what we can see is that this element is in fact visible on page load, which means that it's going to be displayed by default. What I'm going to do though is unselect that should be true, and I'm going to select to collapse this element when it's hidden, which means that it's obviously not going to be displayed on my page. From here though, what we'll need to do is create a condition that just recognizes when the display stage 1 custom state is in fact yes, which of course it is by default. What I'd then like to do is actually display this group. So I'm going to recognize when the custom state stored on our page. Now, in order to reference our overall page, that was known as our listing page. So if I scroll on down to the bottom here, I can reference our overall page. And what you'll now see within our page is both of our custom states that we've created. So I'm going to recognize when the listing page's display stage 1 state is in fact yes. I would like this element to be visible and tick that should be true. And then from here, I'm going to need to do the exact same thing for our second group. So I'm going to select on my second group. I'm going to jump to my layout tab. I'm going to unselect that this should be visible on page load. I'm going to collapse this element when it's hidden. I'll then jump to my conditional tab. I'll define a new condition and I'll recognize when the listing page. So if I scroll on down, I'll select from my listing page here. When its display stage 2 custom state is in fact yes, I would like to select that this element should be visible and also tick that should be true. Now, by default, both of these groups technically aren't going to be displayed on our page. So that just means they're both going to be hidden. Now, if you ever need to display these groups again, you can head over to your elements tree and just select on these. And of course, it will then put them back on your page. One thing I should point out though is that if you remember, by default, our display stage 1 custom state was set to yes, but our display stage 2 custom state was set to no. So we're going to need to create a way to actually update the custom states stored in our page. So that way we can hide our first group and then display our second group. And thankfully, once again, it is a relatively straightforward process to do this. So what we're going to do is select on our continue button here. We're going to jump to our appearance tab. And whenever someone selects this button, I want to hide our first group and display our second group. So I'm going to choose to start a workflow. And within this workflow, it's a super straightforward process. We're just going to type in the word state, and we're going to set the state of an element. The element I'd like to set the state for is our overall listing page, and the custom state will be the display stage 1 custom state. I'm going to now set the value of this to be no, because I no longer want to display our first group. If I set the value of another state, I can then set the display stage 2 custom state to now equal yes. And that means it's going to now display our second group. And so that is how we can create an experience that allows us to show and hide one of these groups at a time. And now that we've taken care of that, we can finally build out the workflow that's actually going to create a new product in our database. And look, I know this has been a long time coming, but I'm finally excited to almost wrap this module up. So if we scroll on down to our second group here, I'm going to select on this continue button. And the first thing I'm going to do is actually update the text within this button. And I'm going to have this display the word publish. I'll then choose to start a workflow whenever this button is clicked. And within this workflow, I'm going to need to do a couple of different things. Obviously, the end goal of this workflow is to create a new product listing. However, if we jump back into our database and head to our data types, you may remember that our product has been broken down into 2 separate data types. So within our overall product data type, we had all of the top line information. So this was just simple information like the category, the description summary, a featured image, a price, a title, and then of course we'd stored all of that heavier data as a separate data type, and we've created a link between the two. So in the product details, this is where we were storing information like the full description as well as the list of images. So what we're actually going to need to do in our workflow is create our product details first, and then we'll need to link that to an individual product. So if we jump to our workflow tab, I'm going to head to our data tab and choose to create a new thing. The type of thing I'd like to create first is actually going to be the product details, because as I said, we're going to need to link this to an individual product. Now, if I was to set the value of these fields, it's going to be relatively straightforward. The full description is going to equal the value of our multi-line input field. So I'm going to select this and choose its value. Then for the images, I'm going to have this be the value of all of the files within my multi-file uploader. So I'm going to set the list of images to be the value of our multi-file uploader. It's nice and straightforward. And now within our workflow, we can go ahead and create our actual product and create the link between these two. So I'm going to add an additional step here. I'm going to head to my data tab and I'm going to choose to create a new thing once again. Only this time we'll be creating the actual product. I'm then going to select to add in all of my fields. So that way I can link all of our relevant data fields to the relevant inputs on our page. So for the category, this of course is going to equal the value of our drop-down category. For the description summary, now this description summary is going to be the same value as the description we just stored within our product details. Only instead of storing the whole description, I'd just like to store the first 50 characters. And I'm going to show you how we can do that. So what I'm going to do is reference once again my multi-line input field, its value. But what I'm actually going to do is select this more option. And if I scroll on down, you'll see this option to truncate to. Now, truncating just means you're going to cut something off. So if I select that I want to truncate this text and type in the number 50, this just means it's going to cut it off at the first 50 characters. So that is the exact experience I want to create. For our featured image, this is going to be the value of our picture uploader featured image. For our price, as you probably guessed, the value of our input gig price. Then for the product details, I'm going to need to link this to the product details we created in step 1 of our workflow. So this is going to be the result of step 1. And finally for our title, this will be the title input field here, its value there. And that is everything we'll need to do when it comes to actually creating a product listing. The very last thing I'd like to do within this workflow though, is just create a navigation event that's going to send someone through to a page where they can later on manage all of their product listings. So in order to do that, I'm just going to add an additional step within this workflow. I'm going to head to the navigation events and select the go to page action. Now at this point in time, our destination page does not yet exist. So we're going to create a new page here and we're just going to call this the manage page. We're going to leave it at that. We're not going to change anything else on this page. And so what I'm going to do is set that the destination page should be this new manage page. And that is all we need to add into this workflow here and all we need to add into this overall page. Now look, before we run a preview of this, there is just one very last thing I want to do, and that is create a way for users to actually navigate to this listing page. So if you remember in our header menu, we'd obviously created some sort of navigation menu. And what we're going to need to do is create a link for someone to click and then be redirected to this particular page here. So in order to do that, I'm going to open up my page drop-down menu. I'll jump over to my header menu and I'm going to open the group that's displayed when a user is logged in. So this is my red group with the 2 existing text elements as well as the profile photo. And now within this group, what I'd like to do is add in another text element. But in order to streamline that process, I'm just going to select on my existing orders text and I'm just going to make a copy of that. Only when it comes to this text here, I'm going to have this display the words post product. And look, if you really wanted to replicate the real world Fiverr product, what you could also do is add an icon element in front of this text. And I'm going to show you a quick little hack as to how you can do that very easily with a text element. If I was to just move my cursor to the very front of this text, I'm just going to add a space in and I'm going to open a square bracket. I'm going to type in the letters FA followed by a closed square bracket. And what this is going to do is just use some basic HTML to add an icon element into my text. I'm then going to add in the name of the icon I would like to display. So in this case, it's just going to be a plus icon. Then from here, I'll close my HTML formatting. So I'm just going to add another open square bracket followed by a /, the letters FA once again, and then a closed square bracket. And what you'll see is that that's going to format this to look just like an icon element. Now, if what I just showed you had completely thrown you off and confused you because you're not familiar with HTML, I do have an existing tutorial on my YouTube channel that runs through this entire process. I didn't want to dive into it in too much detail right now, just because I think that this plus icon is more of a nice to have, it's not essential. But I do just want to focus on one more thing with this text element. So if you think about it, this red group here is going to be displayed to any user who is logged in. Whereas I actually only want this particular text element to be displayed to users who are freelancers, because I only want freelancers to be able to post products and services. So what I'm going to do is need to create a way to hide this text element and then create a condition that recognizes when this should be displayed. So similar to before, I'm going to jump to my layout tab. I'm going to unselect that this element should be visible on page load. I'm also going to collapse this element when it's hidden. I'm then going to need to create a condition that recognizes when this should be shown. And for that condition, I'm just going to recognize when the current user, when their profile type is in fact a freelancer, this element should be visible, and I will tick that that should be true. And if you ever wanted to view that text element again, you could head over to your elements tree, open up this group, and you could select to either hide or display the post product text. Now look, I promise that is everything I wanted to cover within this section of our tutorial. I know this has been a gargantuan section of our tutorial today. There was so much that I wanted to cover throughout this process. What I'd love to do though is just run a quick preview of this, so that way you can see how the whole process is going to function of creating our first freelancing product within our overall marketplace. Over in here, you can see that because I'm logged in as my Lachlan Kirkwood account, who is currently a freelancer, we can see that we have the ability to post a product. Now, one thing I have noticed is that although I added this text in, I did forget to build the workflow that actually navigates us to our listing page. So if we just quickly jump back into Bubble and open up our header menu once again, I'm going to display that text here. I'll double click on this, head to my appearance tab, and just start a workflow whenever this text is clicked. And within this workflow, it's super straightforward. I'm just going to select from the navigation events, select the go to page action, and I'll set the destination page to be our listing page. I apologize that I forgot to explain that. Now, like our existing workflows within our header menu, any navigation event is currently color coded as red. So I'm going to click on our workflow trigger, and I'm going to set the event color here to be red, just so that way it helps me organize these much nicer. I'll then jump back over into my preview, refresh my page here, and what you'll now see is that when I select on this, it'll redirect me through to my listing page. And of course, on this page, because our very first display stage 1 custom state had a default value of yes, what you're going to see is that we only have access to view our very first group. So our second group is currently hidden. Now, what I'm going to do is add in some details for a product that I would like to list. So for the gig title, I'm just going to say social media marketing. For the category, this will come under social media. For the price, I'll say it's $1.99, and then I'll upload a featured image I have on my local device here. Then once I've uploaded that image, I'm going to select this continue button. It's going to hide group number 1 of my product, and now it's going to display group number 2, which is where we can add in all of the details. Now, when it comes to the description of my gig, I'm just going to paste in some dummy text that I have here. I'd then like to upload some images. So I'm going to select in this field, and then I'm going to upload all of these images that I have here. What you'll see is that they will upload into my multi-file uploader, and then they will be displayed within my repeating group, which of course it is recognized at this point that the value of our multi-file uploader is not blank, so that's why it's being displayed. Then from here, I'm happy with my product, so I'm going to choose to publish this. That workflow will run. It will create that entry in our database, and then it's going to redirect us through to our manage page, as you can see here. And of course, at this point in time, this page is currently blank, so there's nothing on it. It's kind of crazy that we spent all that time building that particular process, which took me less than a minute to create a product. Nonetheless though, it was essential for our marketplace today. So what we're going to do is jump back into our Notion checklist and tick off that we've finally finished building out the product to create a product listing. And inside of this, I covered truly everything you need to know about listing a product on a marketplace like Fiverr. And that is all I have time to include within our tutorial today. As you can see, we've been building for hours and there's still so many features that I need to cover in as much detail as I possibly can. If you are interested in watching the rest of this course, I'd recommend hitting the link in the description of this video so that way you can grab the full course from my own website. Now look, while this course is going to cost you money, I'm confident it's going to save you months of your life having to learn how to rebuild each of these features from scratch. So I definitely recommend checking it out if you wanted to launch your app as quickly as possible. Throughout that full course, it's going to explain how we can build out all of the remaining features within our build today. And that's going to include things like being able to process transactions so we can create orders, building out a dashboard where freelancers can manage all of their incoming orders, creating a freelancer profile page, building an inbox page so freelancers can chat with business owners, creating reviews once a freelancer has finished a project, and of course, so much more. I really wasn't lying when I said there's still a whole suite of features that we need to create in order to bring our Fiverr clone to life. In the meantime though, if you wanted to stay up to date with any additional Bubble tutorials I share, I'd always recommend hitting that subscribe button so that way you can be the first to know whenever I drop a new video on my channel. For now though, I just wanted to say a massive thank you for taking the time to watch this much of our video, and I wish you all the best on your own no-code journey.